Good morning and welcome to the 27th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. I would ask everyone in the public gallery to turn off any electrical devices that might interfere with committee proceedings. We've received an apology for today's meeting from committee member Andy Whiteman. Item 1 on the agenda is a decision to take items 5, 6 and 7 in private. Is the committee agreed? Thank you. We now come to item 2 on the agenda, which is pre-budget scrutiny, and I would welcome Derek Mackay, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work, and with them is also Richard Rollison, who's the Interim Director of Economic Development, and Kathleen Swift, the Business Manager. And I understand, Mr. Mackay, you have a brief opening statement, so I'll hand over to you at this point before we come to committee questions.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. The 2019-20 budget sought to strengthen Scotland's economic prosperity against the backdrop of the UK's exit from the European Union. The Scottish Government remains ambitious for our country and the economy. The 2019-20 budget plans invested £5 billion to grow and modernise Scotland's infrastructure. We created the £50 million Town Centre Fund, provided resources to the Scottish National Investment Bank precursor funds and finance its early activities. The programme for government, of course, will work with ensure that we work with partners across our economy to deliver investment with transition to the net zero as its primary mission. We've invested £8.3 million to further progress the new manufacturing institute for Scotland, £65 million committed overall. We are targeting up to £80 million in European funding to establish an advanced manufacturing fund to ensure all parts of Scotland benefit from the developments in advanced manufacturing. And we're investing £20 million over the next 3 years to enhance and intensify support to businesses wishing to export, having published our export plan, A Trading Nation, on the 1st of May. Looking forward to the 2020-21 budget, the UK Government has announced a one-year spending round on the 4th of September. However, without the tax announcements and the economic forecast of a full UK budget, the UK spending round, it does not give us enough clarity of the funding available for Scotland in 2020-21. The UK Government has not yet announced a date for its autumn budget. Exiting the EU, and particularly a disorderly Brexit, will be the biggest and most economically disruptive challenge the Scottish Government has had to face. So prioritisation continues to be necessary to focus resource where it will have the biggest impact, and this is why it's important to undertake a spending review. The spending review will focus on the outcomes and well-being in line with our national performance framework, and our strategic focus will be addressing Scotland's long-term challenges, notably climate change and child poverty. Our economic action plan will be refreshed in the autumn to reflect progress in implementing measures and to reflect new commitments included in this year's programme for government. Its aim is to help build a strong, vibrant and diverse economy that promotes well-being and attracts investment. It's designed to support a competitive business environment, investing in a highly skilled workforce and nurturing the economy of the future. And the actions in this plan will put Scotland at the forefront in transitioning to a carbon-neutral circular economy. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I want to look at the regional distribution of RSA. The objective of RSA is obviously to reduce regional labour inequalities. And Scottish Enterprise told this committee only last week that they were confident that RSA was achieving that objective. However, it took us 3 weeks to get the information that we'd requested off them. It arrived just actually after the committee, or in the afternoon after the committee had met. So, in light of the data that we eventually received, can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether he believes RSA is meeting that objective of combating regional inequality?
Well, I believe that it is meeting that overall objective, and incidentally, if there's any issue, of course, of lack of information, then I'm sure that will be taken up with agencies, and we've certainly reinforced the point that we expect information to come to committees in a timely fashion as well. But we do believe that it is achieving that objective, but RSA, of course, is one part of the overall funding available for business support and to support jobs as well. So it's one strand of that. And because it's a demand-led budget, a demand-led application, I suppose, then that will partly determine where the resources are deployed. But certainly it covers all of Scotland, and we believe it is meeting that objective.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate the comments you make. The highest level of RSA grant available, the Tier 2 sparsely populated areas, this designation covers much of the Highlands and Islands region. So the figures that we did eventually receive show that there had been no RSA grants in the Highlands and Islands area for 3 years. That's none in any of the local authority areas at all. Do you find that surprising? I appreciate it's demand-led, but would you not expect one of the most suitable, perhaps, areas for RSA to have no accepted or no grants in that 3-year period? Would you not find that surprising?
Well, knowing that, I mean, first of all, there's a slight split in responsibility here. Of course, Fergus Ewing leads on the rural economy and is the lead minister in relation to Highlands and Islands and Enterprise. But of course, RSA is delivered by Scottish Enterprise, just for clarity there. In terms of that, because of RSA and the nature of it being demand-led in terms of what projects may come forward, we want to make sure that it can be deployed across Scotland. Of course we do. But I wouldn't put a value judgment on where projects are actually being delivered, as long as we are assured that we're proactively promoting it across the country, that the enterprise agencies, if it's appropriate, are signposting potential investors and companies to RSA in a way that means if there are companies and projects that meet the criteria, they would get it. And I am assured that that is the case, even though, you know, it's true to say there has been no delivery in the fashion that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson has suggested.
So you're confident this is a demand issue within the Highlands and Islands, rather than either businesses aren't aware of it, or the Scottish Enterprise aren't promoting it strongly enough, or there isn't that regional collaboration, cooperation between Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Scottish Enterprise? You think it is purely a demand issue?
Well, I do, because of the other grants and the other investments that are being made in the Highlands and Islands, and because I know the level of joint working between the enterprise agencies would lead me to believe that there is that proactivity. Would I like to see further, you know, distribution of RSA across the country? Of course, I think we share that. But it's certainly not down to any systemic failure. It is down to demand and projects meeting criteria and then being delivered on the ground. And reflecting on my earlier point, it's just one of the tools in the toolbox that can help economic growth in the country.
I appreciate it's just one of the tools, but that would then suggest that the demand isn't coming from the Highlands and Islands area. So why do you think demand isn't high?
I think it might be possibly the nature of the criteria or investment as well. I mean, I haven't had a company say to me that they had tried to pursue it and there was any lack of either awareness or effort to try and secure grants for companies in the Highlands and Islands. Again, Fergus Ewing covers that territory more, but you know, there's an expectation that Scottish Enterprise, as the lead agency, would be proactive in trying to ensure that RSA was deployed, if that was the most appropriate financial mechanism to support that business growth.
When you saw these figures, which showed that there had been no cases in the Highlands and Islands for 3 years, Scottish Enterprise are under your responsibility, what did you ask Scottish Enterprise? Did you clarify for them why there perhaps was these lack of cases? Have you spoken to them about the demand in the region?
This is just one specific funding stream, of course, so I look at all the funding streams and say what's our collective efforts towards growing the economy, sustaining jobs and building in new developments.
Surely you'd have concerns that one, which is albeit one stream, but one quite important stream, had no cases in a suitable area in 3 years.
No, and
you would have been asking questions on that.
So I understand the point that's been made by Mr Johnson, but what I'm trying to reassure the member of is that I'm satisfied that the processes and the actions in place, if there was a company in a project that met the criteria, was up for that investment, I'm quite sure that they would get it if they met all the necessary criteria. So I'm more reassured of that. and knowing that there's a range of tools that can be deployed that will support our economy. But is possibly the nature of scale and manufacturing base, where most of the manufacturing base is in the country, and also where different sectors feature across the geography of our country as well. So tourism, for example, is more of a sector in Highlands and Islands, and therefore I would expect more support to be appropriate there from, say, Visit Scotland, and necessarily just one strand of the funding stream within the enterprise family. I understand the point that's been made. I would expect the enterprise agencies to be proactive in trying to ensure that there is that distribution of funds. But it's not like a formula that you say, you know, it must be spent across the country on almost per head basis. It is where the applications come from, based on the criteria, the demand, the projects, and as I say, in some regards, in relation to RSA, bearing in mind that some elements of RSA can be technology or plant, that, you know, that leads you to where much of the manufacturing base is in the country as well.
I appreciate that, but I'm not, and I'm encouraged that you're reassured, but what I'm trying to find out is why you're reassured, other than you have confidence in Scottish Enterprise are doing their job, and perhaps there are different criteria that may impact on the number of applications. What I'm asking is, has there been any correspondence with Scottish Enterprise to get their assurances of why this situation has come about?
If the committee feels it's not satisfied with that, then I would certainly encourage you to return to Scottish Enterprise as the lead agency to pose those very particular questions about, you know, what are you doing to make sure there's awareness of RSA and then appropriate delivery of it. I'm saying I'm reassured it would be proactive. Why would it be in Scottish Enterprise's interest not to support companies to deliver that? And bearing in mind, again, in the context of RSA, that Highlands and Islands Enterprise have provided £89 million of financial assistance to businesses over the last 5 years. So the point that I'm making is RSA is just one part of financial support, and it has to be seen within the global context. And I'm reassured because I don't see a reason why they wouldn't try to encourage companies right across the country to benefit from RSA. As I say, it might be the nature of the funding, or where the manufacturing base is, or that other tools are more appropriate to Highlands and Islands. Bearing in mind, of course, that a lot of the employers in Highlands and Islands might be of a smaller nature, and therefore other financial tools might be more appropriate.
Even obviously that, as you say, I mean, Highlands and Islands Enterprise is the lead agency, enterprise agency, but they don't administer RSA. Are you content that that collaboration between the two organisations is good enough?
I am.
Okay, thank you.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to return to the issue about the regional imbalances that was being discussed there, but in an Ayrshire context, if you don't mind. I, for one, was really pleased to hear about the change in direction that Scottish Enterprise told us about last year. But Steve Dunlop reminded us that there are difficulties in selling investments, for example, in Ayrshire, the Ayrshire economy, compared to, say, Edinburgh or Glasgow. How do you see us resolving that kind of issue? What are the keys to actually beginning to turn around something like the Ayrshire economy to allow us to get more on a par with, say, Glasgow and the rest of Scotland?
It's wider than just the enterprise agency's intervention. Some of it will be about infrastructure, that can be transport, that can be digital. There are growth deals. We want growth deals to cover every part of the country, and of course there's the Ayrshire growth deal as well, and then other financial mechanisms, and then the fullness of time the Scottish National Investment Bank will be able to invest as well. Having a competitive tax regime is good for the entire country, and then investing in the key strands of the economic strategy around internationalisation, innovation as well, infrastructure and that inclusive growth agenda. But when it comes to the enterprise grants and the enterprise family, they can try and stimulate demand, of course they can, and focus on place and say, you know, different parts of the country it should be considered for investment. But on some of this, we have to follow the economic opportunity of where businesses want to go. And a particular success story at the moment would be at scale Barclays Bank, you know, creating over 2,000 new jobs in Glasgow, but also Barclays is now very involved in Ayrshire, and Kilmarnock, I understand as well. So an example where in establishing where investment is desirable, where it wants to go, and we can try and see if we can get more of the economic benefits to spread beyond just the big cities as well. Cities are important. So the economic strategy tries to support the whole country in a range of different ways. I'm very mindful of scale as well. 20 jobs in a more rural or peripheral community could be massive compared to 20 jobs being created, for example, in the cities of Edinburgh or Aberdeen or Glasgow specifically. So I think that's why we're trying to target efforts towards the towns and rural communities as well as the cities.
Okay, thank you for that.
Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As you say, there are many funds that companies can dip into, but can I ask, really concentrating on RSA, do you believe that RSA grant appraisal process is fit for purpose, given that some firms that have been in receipt of RSA funds have experienced trading difficulties?
Well, let's be clear, a company shouldn't be getting RSA if it's distressed, so to speak. I mean, there's other things the government can do to support a company that is in financial distress. So RSA should be about genuine sustaining jobs or new jobs or investing in that infrastructure. But it is true to say that some companies subsequent to maybe receiving RSA have then got into difficulty, and then the question's asked, were you trying to help this company that was in difficulty? As I say, there are different levers that can be pulled, different interventions we can make, but for a company to receive RSA, Scottish Enterprise must be satisfied that the venture has a reasonable chance of success, and of course all the due diligence would be carried out if that's of assistance.
So basically a company who's applying for RSA should put up the idea that they've got, promote how many jobs they're going to bring to a particular area, wherever it is, and I'm sure we want to encourage people, Highlands and Islands now, to apply for RSA. But basically, do you think RSA, the system in itself, should be reviewed?
Well, I think we, right now, will have to look, as I said at the Scottish National Investment Bank debate just last week, we'll have to look at all the financial products and reflect on them and say, is the range of financial products we have available right and appropriate and need to be rebalanced. And I also want to try and simplify it as much as I can as well. And we may come back to this in relation to how we support businesses because we're pursuing the single portal as well. So I think it's right to look at the range of financial products we have to say what's the appropriate balance going forward, and also how we respond to the economic situation at the time. Where are we with Brexit? Where will we be with demand? What are the banks doing? And again, we may return to that in our Brexit preparedness discussion. But in relation to RSA, to go back to the premise of the question, it should be about protecting jobs and growing jobs. It's not about, so to speak, bailing out a company in difficulty, because it would have to be the due diligence. A company has to be viable, a project has to be worthy, and there's an appraisal process in place to deal with that. As I say, after a company receives RSA, it's not impossible that it gets into difficulty for whatever reason, and of course we would then have to return to that in terms of grants, potential clawback, and if appropriate, potentially further government action. But of course we'd have to comply within the law and state aid legislation as it exists at the time.
Do you think Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise should review how and what they're doing with RSA and how best to improve it? Because we know that it has done a lot of good. As you say, it's went into various firms and promoted jobs and improved jobs and brought jobs. And I think they're less, no one can tell the future tomorrow, sadly. But basically the situation is that there has been some companies who have got RSA but were doing well at the time, and maybe a year down the line, and no one could have predicted that they hit a financial wall. So do you think Scottish Enterprise and HIE could do more to review, look at, improve? What discussions would you have with them?
So let me separate the question out into two component parts. First of all, I do think we need to review all our financial products. because we'll have to do that now facing the economic turbulence that we're facing anyway, or more positively, because we're developing a national investment bank, that we should always have been looking at the financial products and say, you know, what's the criteria for each? How do we respond to the needs of the economy? So I think that should have happened anyway. A second point is, though, that's not because I think there's an issue with the appraisal mechanism around RSA. Not every company will be a success, unfortunately. And there are some risks, a risk analysis will be taken. Some will succeed and some will fail. So we'll never resolve the issue that not every company will be a success. But I do think we should focus on what financial products are available in responding to both the challenges we're about to face inevitably and the opportunities there are in the economy as well. And that's something I'm engaging with the enterprise family on.
So lastly, you all have your critics. But basically, you believe that all the things that we're doing have possibilities to improve the economy of Scotland.
Yes, of course. And I have, as have my ministerial colleagues, visited many of these companies where, you know, some companies would not have grown, would not have kept jobs, and indeed some companies may not have invested in Scotland if it wasn't for RSA. And surely we all share a passion in this committee to try and support and create new quality jobs, and I do believe RSA has been achieving that.
Thank you.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Deloitte's published a report recently on unlocking productivity across UK regions and nations, and its main findings on Scotland stated that productivity growth in Scotland has outperformed the UK average in recent years, closing a previous gap. The ONS data positions Scotland's output per hour worked at 99.8% of the UK average. What impact has RSA had on the productivity of recipient companies?
Well, certainly we're focusing on productivity, and CBI and KPMG, I was at the launch, have just launched a new index around productivity, and there has been a real focus on it. We've performed better over the period of devolution compared to the rest of the UK, but certainly we lag international standards in comparison. So we want that to improve, of course we do. And there are many areas of intervention, I think, that will make a difference here, whether it is around innovation, whether it is around digital and a skilled workforce as well. But RSA, in terms of its very specific criteria around safeguarding jobs, doesn't necessarily in itself enhance productivity, but safeguarding jobs is a good thing nonetheless. But if the grant is maybe contributing to plant or machinery or technology, then that should enhance productivity. So if its primary objective is safeguarding jobs, delivering new quality jobs, that's a good thing. That may well help with productivity, but understanding definitions of productivity, simply having more people might not in itself help productivity output per hour, you know, but some of the other strands of RSA may well help and should help with productivity. But again, wider than just RSA, because I think if we're just focusing on RSA, we're missing a hell of a lot more in terms of support for our economy that is supporting the productivity challenge we face in our country. I should say at this point, though, that it appears right now that productivity progress has been impeded because of Brexit. Companies are putting more effort into Brexit preparedness and caution around investment than the productivity challenge, and that's something that we should keep a very close eye on.
There's a review of...
I think Jackie Bailey is disagreeing to that point. She may want to ask the Chief Economist about it when he attends in the next session.
I'm happy to ask you, Cabinet Secretary, later.
And Cabinet Secretary, could we also watch in terms of language?
What did I say?
I don't know what he said.
I don't know what he said. Anyway,
I'm not going to repeat it.
What did I say? I'm not sure what I said, though, Convener, so I'll watch whatever I said that I don't know what I said.
I'll be careful what I say, because I've got no idea what you said.
Well, I think what you said was what the hell, something or other, so I think that could be offensive to certain people, so I think...
Anyway, to continue, the last time RSA was reviewed, the report stated The most common effects were on productivity and sales growth, improved efficiency of machinery and the introduction of new or significant improved products or processes. That was the last time it was reviewed, and it reviewed related to 2000 to 2004. The current review that's underway, when are we likely to hear the outcome of that review that's taking place at the moment? And do you think it will have a similar similar outcome to the previous report?
If I can bring Richard Rollison in on that one, yeah.
I think perhaps you're referring to the review that Scottish Enterprise is doing across a number of grant products, and I think they're due to report that towards the end of this year, and have maybe provided some initial findings to the committee already.
You touched upon the Scottish Productivity Index that was launched recently and the needs for skills. That Productivity Index launch highlighted the need for prioritising investment in management and leadership skills, plus a need for everyone in the workforce to be given basic digital training by 2025. Now, given that the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board has tasked both the enterprise agencies and skills agencies to collectively improve productivity, working with industry and businesses, what are the enterprise agencies doing to tackle this challenge?
Well, they will engage with individual companies and can come up with a bespoke package for those individual companies around management or training or expertise. And sometimes support for businesses include bringing in expertise as well. In fact, in the Brexit preparations right now, there's particular grant support to look at expertise to bring in preparations for Brexit. But as I say, enterprise agencies can support companies on training, and research and development is important as well, and we're increasing the support around research and development. But I think importantly here, partly what the CBI and the KPMG work projected was also a responsibility on business as well. And a lot of businesses are just struggling to get by, but also need to look to the future, invest in quality, invest in management and training, and in all of that, there's a responsibility amongst businesses to look at their own structures, see what support's available. And there's also support from Skills Development Scotland as well. So as I say, there is a response around management challenge, around quality and skills and reskilling as well. So there is support there.
Jackie Bailey.
Come in on the productivity challenge, given the invitation by the Cabinet Secretary to do so. He will, of course, remember not that it was his responsibility, but one of his predecessors set a target to move Scotland's productivity from the second quartile of the OECD index to the first quartile. In fact, during the period your target was in place, it fell to the third quartile. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would want to confirm that this was during a period where Brexit wasn't even a twinkle in anyone's eye. So the truth is, we haven't done well with productivity despite the Scottish Government target, and it has nothing to do with Brexit.
I think the point that I was making, and I think it's an important point because I know Jackie Bailey is against Brexit as well. The point that I was making is the current intel, so I was given the most up-to-date position, is that gains made on productivity will be lost and impeded. I'll come back to the past, but I think it's important to say right now that we can only make progress from here into the future. We can't change the past, but from here into the future, right now, productivity gains are being lost because of Brexit uncertainty. In terms of the past, there was also a financial crash, and the downturn in the oil and gas sector also impacted on the economy and on productivity. So I think there are reasons for those statistics, but it is still also true to say that we have done better than the rest of the UK over the period of devolution, but not as well by international standards. And again, the most recent statistics have shown a better performance in relation to the rest of the UK.
Cabinet Secretary, I think your ambition is pretty low if all you're doing is comparing yourself to the rest of the UK when they've had a particularly bad performance round about productivity. I think my issue is you need to understand the past and why we failed in terms of productivity increases in order to inform the future. And simply blaming it on Brexit, I don't think gets us there.
You I think what I was trying to do was to express that we can't change the past, although the most recent figures that I have in 2019 Q1, productivity growth in Scotland was 0.4%, following growth of 0.2% Q4 of 2018 in the latest year. In the year up to Q1 2019, productivity in Scotland grew 1.1% compared to a fall in productivity of 0.2% for the UK as a whole. And over that longer term, between 2017 and 2018, productivity in Scotland has grown at an annual average rate of 1% per year compared to the UK average of 0.2% over that period. But I agree with Jackie Baillie, we don't want to just match the UK, we want to perform like small advanced economies around the world, independent economies who have done much better than the UK and much better than Scotland. That is true, Jackie Baillie. That's what I aspire to.
Convener, I love the Cabinet Secretary's ambition, but he still remains, and Scotland remains, in the third quartile of the OECD indicators. That doesn't sound terribly positive.
And that's why our economic strategy around innovation, internationalisation, more around infrastructure, more around quality and upskilling and reskilling will all make a difference in terms of the productivity challenge. But it's true to say that the greatest threat to the productivity opportunity and challenge right now is the threat that we're facing from Brexit.
We'll move on to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, earlier this morning you referred to RSA being demand-led. Scottish Enterprises' submission highlights their demand stimulation activities around RSA. What are your views on the role of Scottish Enterprise in trying to influence or create demand for their products?
Well, I think I believe and know that they are being very proactive through their communication systems. They can respond to individual economic circumstance with bespoke packages of support. They will signpost to the most appropriate kind of financial support or opportunity as well. So from all of that, I'm reassured that they are promoting what is available right now. But right across the range of assistance that we have for businesses, I do want to simplify that, which is why I'm so supportive of the single portal, so that businesses can come in once and then it's up to the enterprise agencies to organise what the appropriate response is and what package of support can help any individual applicant or company. And I think that's why the diagnostics behind it, the kind of front-facing business support will be so important.
I guess the question then is, if Scottish Enterprise are trying to create or influence demand for their products, is there a risk that there could be a mismatch in the products they're offering versus what the market is actually looking for?
Yes, that of course is not impossible, but what that must lead to the ability to be agile and adept in changing the criteria or the products, keeping the principles, but responding to what the economy and businesses actually want and need. And I'm actually seeing that and have seen that. One at scale, for example, is Michelin. So the company, as we know, decided to cease tyre manufacturing at the plant, but we were able to convince them to stay. And then we look at the appropriate support that might be relevant going into the future in ensuring that we have a package of support that's right for that investment, but hasn't necessarily, been a specific product in the past. So I am seeing that agility in the enterprise family. The same goes for Skills Development Scotland as well, of course, because the number one biggest issue with businesses right now is actually skills and availability of people in terms of those challenges. Therefore, it's important to align skills and Skills Development Scotland with financial assistance that I know this committee is focusing on this morning.
I guess the concern is that if the products are all off-the-shelf products, and you've highlighted specific events, for example, Michelin, where there has been that flexibility and so forth, but these are high-profile events that you would hope there would be that flexibility in. But if you're just an ordinary Joe Bloggs company coming for an off-the-shelf product, how do we ensure that there's no mismatch in what is being offered off the shelf when Scottish Enterprise are the ones that are, pushing those products, and they obviously have their targets?
Just a reminder that over the last 5 years, over nearly 400 companies have benefited from RSA. So that's nearly 400 companies over the period of 5 years, just from RSA. But in terms of wider products, there is a very wide range of financial products able to support businesses. However, I would, and I am reassured that we can create bespoke packages and actually engage with companies themselves to design the financial support that's right for them. So I'm trying to emphasise the point that it can be bespoke, it can be tailored to the needs of a business. And then if particular funds are not successful, either look at the criteria or discontinue that fund to expand other things. And that is the approach I've seen take place.
So you're satisfied that even in the sort of day-to-day activities around RSA, there is that flexibility to allow companies to get a product that is actually tailored for their specific needs in their particular sector?
If you're just being specific to RSA again, then there's criteria set for that. I'm talking about the overall package right across the whole system. You know, no company would go into Scottish Enterprise and say, I'm only interested in RSA. They say, how can you help us? So that's why I'm saying the full toolbox is really appropriate here. And we can certainly come back to you with examples of how that's been the case, if that's of assistance to the committee. What I want to do, though, with responsibility right across this, is ensure that there's alignment and cohesion, and we're making it as easy as possible for companies to get the widest range of support, so we can have a package of support. And that goes beyond just one enterprise agency. As I say, it might be skills, it might be Visit Scotland. You know, that there's different ways we can support a company that's sensitive to their individual needs. So yes, we can deliver a tailored package to a company. And as I say, I can come back if you want individual examples of how we've been able to do that, if that's of assistance.
Be of interest.
Yeah.
Yes. Just moving on slightly, looking at the strategic direction of Scottish Enterprise, they're shifting to a broader support role for businesses to help create quality jobs and tackle inequalities and so on. However, the former Chief Executive of Scottish Enterprise, Jack Perry, in this month's Business Insider magazine, revealed certainly frustrations and possibly disagreement on Scottish Enterprise's current direction. And he stated that he believed that the new strategy is based on political rather than economic goals, and that Scottish Enterprise is creating the conditions for more disappointment in the future. What are your views to these comments?
Jack is totally entitled to his opinion, naturally, and I actually think that it's a good thing if the enterprise agency is responding to the strategic guidance that we give them, to the National Performance Framework. And actually, I remember attending this committee for the first time when I had responsibility for the economy, and I said I wanted to respond to the committee's report in terms of how it supports businesses and the economy, the consensus that exists in the Parliament, and I think in ensuring that the enterprise agencies respond to that political direction. Every member of this committee is political. We are trying to ensure that we're supporting the economy in a really inclusive way. And of course that's moved on. For example, if you take the politics of the climate emergency, clearly that will feature in our policies going forward. So the enterprise agencies have a clear economic function, but it's also to understand the political direction of the country, and I've tried to act in a really consensual way. And some of the themes that this committee reinforced was support businesses no matter of scale. Place was really important. You've emphasised that again this morning. Not just pursue what some would describe as the inward investment at scale, but look at the businesses that can grow in Scotland and have a real focus on jobs. And that's the kind of political direction we've given. This committee has agreed with that direction of travel. And so I will defend the plans from Scottish Enterprise, because I think it reflects what we're seeking as a country, as a parliament and as a government.
Is there a danger in adopting a broader support approach, that the product offering might be diluted?
No, I think it will be more sensitive to the opportunities that exist. And Scottish Enterprise right now can achieve both. So it's helped attract Barclays, which is an investment at scale, over 2,500 new jobs at scale in Glasgow, but can also support those smaller businesses that want to develop as well. And if we've got a real focus on jobs, and bear in mind we had unemployment at the lowest levels in history. Now it's going back up because of the Brexit issues, but we had unemployment at a record low of 3.2%, now increasing. Then I think that direction and that investment has been worthwhile. So no, I don't think it will be diluted. And I'm also very mindful of the committee's work around Business Gateway, where again this committee specifically charged me to ensure there was deeper integration with Business Gateway and the enterprise agencies and focus more on that kind of agenda. So it's hard to then criticise the enterprise agencies for responding to the agenda that the committee made in its own recommendations that I have supported.
Given again the broadening of the approach, I suppose you would think there would need to be more resources available to be able to do that. Are there adequate resources in place?
I believe there's adequate resources. If you look at the internationalisation strand, we've allocated new resources around the export strategy. So we have that 3-year plan, so there's £20 million additional resource allocated. And also restructuring and reconfiguring what the enterprise agencies do is important, because I want to be as efficient as possible. And of course there has been a recalibration of the resources within the enterprise agencies as well. And I think that's redirected the agencies towards our priorities. I wouldn't say it's just broadening, but in some regards it's deepening as well. So we're doing more around digital, we're doing more around that skills gap, around gender as well. And on innovation, there's additional funding, as I say, the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, the Advanced Manufacturing Challenge Fund. So there's very specific resources to help us with what we've identified are key strands of the economic strategy, whilst the expectations that the enterprise agencies were to be more efficient. And I remember giving evidence, I think it was to the Economy Committee before, that some of the savings made within Scottish Enterprise were operational savings, and that's targeting more resources to the front line.
Dean Locker.
Thank you, Convener. Last week, an Audit Scotland report highlighted that the Scottish Government has lost £135 million last year alone in failed interventions and investments into companies. That's roughly half of the entire budget for Scottish Enterprise, and it's more than has been paid out under the Scottish Growth Scheme in the past 3 years. Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise the real concerns over the amount of losses, the amount of taxpayers' money that has been lost in these failed investments, and what financial return does he expect to receive from that £135 million investment, and how will he measure the return on that investment?
I'm not quite sure how the workers at Ferguson's, of which there are over 300, or at Prestwick Airport, or at BIFAB, will like to hear the Conservatives describe them as failed ventures. The reality here is...
That's how the Audit Scotland referred to them in their report, and they also highlighted £135 million has been written off last year alone. So the question is, I'm asking, I'm not second-guessing the merits of the individual interventions. I'm asking about how you will measure the financial returns on that £135 million.
I'm assured in asking the question that Dean Lockhart understood that it was investment in those kind of companies that the Auditor General was talking about. And it's not a write-off, incidentally, Convener, it's a write-down, and of course there's a distinction between the two. It's also not impossible that a value of investment does go back up. And I just say again to the Conservatives, just know what you're criticising when you criticise. I've been perfectly clear that what these have been investments that the government has made, going through all the due diligence to invest in companies to allow them to have a future. And specifically, they are Prestwick Airport, BIFAB, and Ferguson's. Now, if members say we shouldn't have invested in such companies, that's an opinion, but it's been the view of the Scottish Government that these were the right interventions to make at the time. We've gone through due diligence. Of course, I want them to be a success. I want them to be a return to the taxpayer. But if we hadn't have made those interventions, many hundreds of jobs would have been lost and not recovered. So what this is the government using our fiscal power to invest in the country, to support the economy. And of course, there is always risk with such an investment. But I hope in all of those examples, the situation will absolutely be turned around, that BIFAB will achieve a supply of work, the employment numbers will go back up, and the company's finances will be strengthened. I hope that in terms of Presswick, it is a viable future. And of course, my position in Ferguson's and FML, it was well understood that I do believe that that shipyard in the Clyde also has a future. But that's the reason for those write-downs. And I think it was the right thing to do for the Scottish Government to intervene, and we are being accountable in the resources that we have deployed.
I think the concern, Cabinet Secretary, is the policy approach taken by the Scottish Government in intervening in certain areas. Audit Scotland said last week, the Scottish Government has not developed a clear framework to outline its approach to financial interventions in private companies. We've heard evidence time and again at this committee that inclusive growth is ill-defined and is not fit to shape policy intervention. So the question I have, Cabinet Secretary, is these interventions look ad hoc and is not part of an overall economic policy, a coherent economic policy approach. We heard that in evidence in relation to the Scottish National Investment Bank. Inclusive growth as a concept, the Scottish Government's overriding strategy, is not defined. The Fraser-Vounder has called for more clarity of focus in relation to the Scottish Government's economic policy. So what I'm asking you is, when it comes to issues like inclusive growth, which means different things to different people, and when it comes to your policy of intervening in the economy, when are we going to see more clarity in relation to economic policy?
Can I say in relation to sometimes are the financial interventions ad hoc? Well, of course they are, because you don't know necessarily where the economic difficulties are going to come from, which company might happen to get into trouble. And that was my point that I was just been pressed on earlier about, can the government respond in a fashion that can tailor an economic intervention to the specific circumstances of a company. And I think that then speaks to the point that you can have an economic strategy that focuses on increased prosperity, greater equality, and with strands of internationalisation, innovation, that inclusive growth agenda around fair work and infrastructure. But when it comes to some companies who require government support, then I think it's been the right thing to do. It wouldn't be true to say that there isn't a framework around that, or there isn't due diligence, or there isn't commercial advice. Every intervention we make financially has to be within the law. Our investments have to consider the public sector finance manual. They all have to meet due diligence. They have to be value for money. They have to meet state aid rules. They have to meet market economy principles as well. There's actually a range of documents that are used to guide any investment decision. So I would just disagree to say that there isn't a framework or a context in which the decisions are made. But there's a political decision and determinant as well. Is the government and its agencies willing to step in to save jobs and invest in the economy, yes or no? And we've chosen yes in those instances where we believe it's appropriate so to do. And that has borne fruit in terms of saving companies and allowing other investments to be made and saving hundreds of jobs across the country, which I think do add to the range of businesses operating in our country. In terms of the issue around inclusive growth, I know we've had this debate before, but I think the definition is clear around inclusive growth. And of course, there's an even greater focus on sustainable economic growth. But inclusive growth is defined as growth that combines increased prosperity with greater equity, that creates opportunities for all and distributes the dividends of increased prosperity fairly. Of course, that I think is evidenced through the Fair Work agenda. We're focusing on place and we're tackling inequality as we ensure there's investment. And it's largely around jobs, the real driving force in our economic strategy around jobs and ensuring that jobs are distributed and remunerated as fairly as possible. So I do believe there's a very strong policy context, that economic strategy, and then the economic action plan that I published last year that, as I say, I'll refresh shortly.
One very brief follow-up on inclusive growth. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any plans to develop the definition? Because we had all the enterprise agencies here telling us it means different things to different people and that they cannot measure it precisely. So if you're telling me you have finished with the definition, my contention is it is not an economic definition that you can measure, and it is not one that you can measure changes in.
Let me try and find a point of consensus with Dean Lockhart, and it's this. Maybe the definition I think is fine, and I think the National Performance Framework clearly sets out purpose and values and indicators and outcomes. Now, the reason that I know that purpose and that definition must be okay is because I think it was Murdo Fraser sat on the cross-party group to help us characterise and define that purpose. So there was a cross-party approach to that. All parties were on it. So I think we have a purpose that achieved a great deal of consensus in Parliament and across the parties. I think the definition is clear, but I think how it's expressed by way of actions is really helpful. And I think that's where the Economic Action Plan comes in. I think that's where the detailed points around what does the Fair Work agenda look like, how do we spread the wealth within our country, how do we tackle well-being and that outcomes focus. I think all of that is covered in more detail through the actions. So maybe the point of consensus is if we can show further actions that help us achieve the purpose, then that would be helpful for all.
A brief follow-up from Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much. Cabinet Secretary, Prestwick Airport was mentioned there. I have to speak up for the airport, of course, as an Ayrshire MSP. I think it's unthinkable what could have happened to the wider Ayrshire economy had that intervention not taken place. I thought it had broad support within the Parliament. It certainly does have from the local member there, John Scott, who's championed it for many years and still does that. But my brief question to you was on the strategic direction issue that was raised by Colin Beattie. Do you think that the emergence of the growth deals have been, in a sense, the kind of catalyst for that new regional kind of economic partnership to emerge? I don't think there's detriment to the former growth sectors that we previously focused on with Scottish enterprise, and I'm happy and delighted that this new change of approach is taking place. So do you think the growth deals have played a key part in rethinking that, and does that link in with your overall economic strategy for us, for Scotland?
Growth deals have been quite an iterative process where each one has developed over and above the last one, so they've kind of changed their shape. The first big one, our first one indeed, was with Glasgow, that felt quite a lot about infrastructure, and then latterly felt a bit more about inclusive growth. Edinburgh's and the Lothians has been more about economic opportunity and data and some of that, and then the Ayrshire growth deal, of course, is a mixture of infrastructure and other job creating opportunities as well. So they are all now quite different. The way they've been negotiated is between the local authority, Scottish Government, UK Government. The financing package is varied from one to the next. But what it's helped us to do is bring together regional partners to discuss what investments might be right for that region. So it's been helpful in that regard. Of course, there has been financial leverage as well as a consequence, and there's been improved relations with both academia and the business community. Could it be better? Yeah, I think that's possible too, in terms of a more systematic approach, but essentially we can address that through, I think, regional economic partnerships, and we want growth deals, of course, to cover the whole country as well. But there's now a very sizable chunk of money that will feed through the growth deals to help us stimulate the economy, and the partnerships are undoubtedly stronger as a result, and that's between local authorities as well as with government, and it is absolutely part of the economic strategy, particularly around some of the themes on innovation and infrastructure. For the avoidance of doubt, Michael Matheson leads on growth deals.
Cabinet Secretary, just very brief point. Last year the committee noted the enterprise agencies sat and marked their own homework, I think was our words, and I don't want to misquote you, but I think in your response on that you said that the strategic board's analytical unit was developing a measurement framework. And I think evidence of the committee since then has suggested that not a lot of progress has been made on that. Are you able to give us an update on where we're at with that?
I think there has been good progress. I can return to some of the indicators, but a more detailed assessment of performance will be provided to the board. That's the strategic board in the annual report, which is due in January. So that'll be January next year, and we'll have that detailed report. I believe there has been progress on those indicators, as I say, rather than just allow the enterprise agencies to do it for themselves, and it will cover indicators such as spend on research and development as a percentage of GDP, value of international exports, workplace learning in the last 3 months, percent of establishments with skills shortage vacancies, gender pay gap, employees earning less than a living wage, carbon footprint, school leavers qualifications, and high growth business as a percentage of all enterprises. So, again, it's my understanding the framework was approved by the strategic board in March, and the board has received quarterly updates of performance against those high-level indicators in the framework. So, but further information should be forthcoming.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. The Cabinet Secretary has also mentioned our previous business support inquiry, but I wonder whether I could just press him for a bit of detail, particularly in relation to Business Gateway as part of that wider enterprise support system. Can he tell us what progress has been made and when he expects that to happen? And equally, he mentioned the single portal, single entry point for enterprise support. Again, can he give us some detail about when he expects this to happen?
Convener, I think it's a good point, because I think the two are actually connected, because I looked very closely at the committee's report on Business Gateway, and I've engaged with local government, recognising that Business Gateway, resting with local government at the moment, whatever I do, I should do in partnership. So I've met with their economy spokesperson, Councillor Heddle, and I've raised it at the meetings I've had with the resources spokesperson as well, Gail McGregor. There has been exchange of communication. I understand COSLA leaders are considering the approach around Business Gateway. What I feel is the best way forward, because I think part of the critique from the committee is it felt a bit patchy across the country, and it could be better connected with the rest of the enterprise families' operations. I think there's a lot of merit in that, and I think the best way to address it is then connect it with the work around the single portal, which was the second part of Jackie Bailey's question. So bringing together the complexity of financial products and various forms of support for businesses, my aspiration is to make it as easy as possible for businesses, no matter the scale, small or large, start-up, set-up, scale-up, to make one point of entry, and then the system works to give back the appropriate support for that organisation and that company, as they no matter the scale. So that's my ambition around the single portal. Now, because of the complexity out there right across Skills Development Scotland, enterprise agencies, even universities through interface where they actually connect academic and innovation opportunities with business as well, it is complex. So bringing it all together and making sure Business Gateway is part of that is my ambition. I want to bring them with me in that journey. Now, my first impressions is that they are up for that, and I think that is very welcome to be part of that whole system approach. Scottish Enterprise might be able to say more about the detailed timescales, but as I was last updated, that ambition should begin with a beta version of the system, which will be ready by the end of this year. So that's the first stage of bringing it all together, and that would provide customers with the ability to see and access the most commonly searched products and services offered across the main enterprise and skills agency and Business Gateway's national site. So I think that would be good to bring all of that together to then have as much as possible on the system thereafter next year. So the engagement with Business Gateway has been positive so far, but because of the nature of that local government function, I'm trying to do it in partnership with them rather than, instruct that. I'm sure there'd be some sympathy for, but but it wouldn't be a partnership approach. So I'll certainly update the committee if they are not coming in with us to this national project.
I think that would certainly be very welcome from the Cabinet Secretary. Can I turn now to the Scottish European Growth Co-Investment Programme? That was part of the 500 million Scottish Growth Scheme announced to considerable fanfare by the First Minister and indeed welcomed across the Chamber. But I think the Cabinet Secretary would agree with me, there have been very disappointing numbers accessing funding from the 200 million budget that is the co-investment programme. In the first year there was one project, second year there were 2 more companies, but the total SE contribution was 3.2 million out of a 200 million overall expected budget. That was certainly the case in June 2019. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what is the case now? Are demand stimulation activities in place and bearing fruit? And he'll appreciate our concern because these self-same enterprise agencies are the ones that are going to stimulate demand for the proposed Scottish National Investment Bank. If they can't do it for this, how can we be confident that they'll do it for the new bank?
So I want to begin by giving the information as I have it right now, which was the first question that Jackie Bailey posed. In terms of the overall £500 million from the Scottish Growth Scheme, the scheme is demand-led, and to date 233 companies have received some £149.5 million of investment. Of course, there's a range of support within that. I'm sure that Jackie Bailey would appreciate that the uncertainty in the economy right now has impacted on demand in terms of the funds that are available. Many firms, many companies would have got support from the government and their agencies, but not under the umbrella of this particular growth scheme. And so I think just to look at this would be wrong when there's other strands of financial support out there, but because of the nature of some of this, in terms of whether it's scale or whether it's co-investment, or whether it's the issue about companies investing for growth right now, it would be true to say, even a critic would suggest and agree right now that a lot of investment isn't taking place right now because of Brexit uncertainty. And therefore, for the government to co-invest has been more difficult where some of the investment has been drying up because of Brexit. We have tried to stimulate demand. The Enterprise Agency has tried to signpost companies towards the Scottish Growth Scheme, and I would have liked to have seen more come through this. But it is also true to say that financial support has come from other government strands to ensure that we've been supporting companies over the last few years.
And I accept that, and I note that the Cabinet Secretary gave us the figures for the Scottish Growth Scheme. Could he give us the figures for the Scottish European Growth Co-Investment Programme, which is a strand of that overall scheme?
So that is specifically 6 businesses of £17 million.
That includes the contribution from the business itself, or is this just purely the 17 million out of the SE budget?
Can I turn to official for that detail?
It's the shared investment between the venture fund managers and Scottish Enterprise into the businesses. And there's another £6 million on top of that 17 that isn't actually part of the programme but has still come in through other mechanisms.
Okay, so it's lower than anticipated. I accept entirely what the Cabinet Secretary says about uncertainty, but this was a fund to help companies deal with Brexit. And therefore, I wonder whether, with reflection, we don't think that this is perhaps the wrong product at this particular point in time.
I think it's one of many. If I could go back to the inception of the growth scheme itself, it was considered in its early days that it was actually going to be contingent liabilities. It was going to be guarantees, if all members remember correctly, and that was going to be a very useful way of getting leverage in to support businesses. And that was partly advised through the understanding from companies as to what might have been helpful, and from the banks on where there might have been a gap in funding available. So considering that it was first meant to be guarantees, so that would have been contingent liabilities that would have only have crystallised, I suppose, if that call upon of resource actually happened. And then, of course, it was developed to have that umbrella of different funds and investments, the co-investment fund. And so it has tried to adapt over time. But Jackie Bailey's right. Again, this is demand-led and does require co-investment in part for some of these funds. And if, because of the nature of the economy or the investment position at the moment, then it hasn't achieved that figure. But overall, the support to business has still been delivered. And as I say, knowing that there was a view in the early days around contingent liabilities, and the government using the strength of its balance sheet to support business, we've actually done that. Because you then turn to the question that Dean Lockhart asked me about, which was the writing down of investments, which was equity investments into companies, I suppose could have been considered as, oh, that's what the Scottish Growth Scheme could have been, but that's separate to how we've actually delivered the growth scheme. So we have tried to respond to where demand is, where investment could be. And again, these are just different tools in the box to try and support and stimulate the economy. But it was first envisaged that these would be contingent liabilities. We changed it into investment and co-investment funds. And the figures speak for themselves, that there has been some leverage, but not as much as we would have hoped through this particular scheme, but still plenty of support elsewhere in different financial products that we have.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Richard Lyle.
Yes. Cabinet Secretary, I know you have a great grasp of your remit. I want to ask you a question about Highlands and Islands enterprise. And I know this agency falls within the remit of the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy, Fergus Ewan. But there is, and I believe that Highlands and Islands have done wonders for the Highlands since they've been first set up. But there are, however, a number of financial risks that are set out in their annual report. Regard to Space Hub, Southern, VAT liability, Cairngorm for nuclear, impact of the sale of CFHS, Centre of Health and Science. Are you satisfied that HIE has the expertise to manage these risks?
Convener, I really appreciate that Richard Lyle started with a compliment and then complimenting me on the grasp of my own remit, but it would be wrong for me to overreach into the remit of other Cabinet Secretaries. As Finance Secretary, I am generally satisfied that other Cabinet Secretaries are looking at those issues, and my awareness of Highlands and Islands enterprise. We'd expect them to operate within value for money, due diligence, Scottish Public Sector, Scottish Public Finance Manual, and other commercial advice as they would receive it for any investment that they make, and I am satisfied that they would do that. As to the detail of any project, then I would suggest you have Fergus Ewan here and grill him in the way that you grill me.
No, I think we never grill you. I think we'll write to Mr Ewing in regards to the question I was going to ask. Thank you. If the convener agrees.
I think we're probably, well, we'll discuss it as a committee. I'm sure we'll be very happy to write to the appropriate minister to ask the question. We wouldn't want the Cabinet Secretary here to overreach. Brief follow-up from Dean Lockhart.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the £149 million paid out under the Scottish Growth Scheme. I just wanted to confirm, maybe I missed it, is this the total including private sector co-invested money, or is this just the Scottish enterprise slice?
Can I check with officials? Because I want to give an inaccurate figure.
Okay. So that's the total investment that's gone through both the fund providers and any public sector money. So it's a shared approach. It's the total sums going in.
Okay. And if you were just to look at the public sector contribution to that 149, what would that public sector number be?
I'd need to come back to you on that.
Okay. Do you have a rough feeling, or would it be half, or?
So it's somewhere in my pack.
Can we do it in writing?
Right.
You don't have the figures to hand, that's fine.
That'd be useful, thank you.
Right. We come to a close on this item of the agenda then, and I think we'll just I'll suspend the meeting briefly to allow a changeover of officials. The Cabinet Secretary is remaining with us, I believe. We now come to item 3 on our agenda, which is leaving the European Union without a deal. Again, we're joined by Derek Mackay, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work, and with him Kevin Quinlan, Director for International Trade and Investment, and Gary Gillespie, Chief Economist. So welcome to the two of you. I understand, Cabinet Secretary, you have an opening statement, so I'll hand over to you at this stage.
Thank you, Convener. The uncertainty around Brexit is already having a detrimental economic impact in Scotland. Instead of planning for Brexit, firms could be focusing on developing their business and be working to increase productivity, something we had discussed earlier today. Any form of Brexit will have a further detrimental impact in Scotland. A no-deal Brexit will create an immediate dislocation for the economy, which has the potential to impact through many channels, including investment, uncertainty, logistics, trade, stilling, regulatory, financial and fiscal, which will have an impact on individual businesses, sectors and communities. And we know that from the Scottish Government analysis, alongside OBR, Bank of England, and other independent forecasters, that no deal will tip the Scottish economy into recession and reverse the recent gains in the labour market, which could see unemployment rising by up to 100,000. Of course, as a responsible government, although we do not want to leave the EU, we have to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. There is what we can plan for, but there will also be many unknown unknowns with Brexit. So, we have planned a range of interventions and options that we can deploy in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and we need to be agile in determining which to deploy and when, based on an assessment of the situation as it unfolds. So I'm clear that the funding for these interventions should have come from the UK Government. The Scottish Budget has been agreed by Parliament and is fully committed. If resource is not forthcoming by the UK Government, we will be faced with the choice to either cut funding for public services or not to deploy contingency plans in the way that we would want. Now, we have organised a response to Brexit in 3 phases: resilience, recovery and restructuring. On resilience, we're engaging with business organisations across Scotland and seeking to address their concerns as best we can. This includes providing bespoke information for how businesses can prepare for Brexit and supporting access to finance for businesses of all sizes. And we're also doing this primarily through the Prepare for Brexit website, which has now had over 100,000 site visits with 6,000 company assessments completed. As recently as last week, I met with the chief executives of our enterprise and skills agencies to take stock of our Brexit response and to ensure that we are aligned in our approach moving forward. Within all of this, we have 3 lines of defence. We're working closely with the banks, encouraging them to make funding available and signposting businesses to go to them in the first place. And I'm convening a meeting of the Banking Economy Forum later today, and I'll continue to impress upon them the important role they have in stepping up to the plate and helping Scottish business post-Brexit. The second line is to look to the UK Government to step up and provide support to businesses suffering as a result of Brexit, primarily through the British Business Bank. And finally, businesses will be able to access the existing Scottish Government and agency support, and we've planned a range of interventions and options that we can deploy in the event of a no-deal Brexit. We need to be agile in determining which to deploy based on an assessment of the situation as it unfolds. In terms of recovery, a revised and updated version of our Economic Action Plan will be launched later in the autumn, setting out the wide range of activities and interventions we're undertaking to help deliver sustainable and inclusive economic growth. As we know, Brexit impacts real people, and our Future Skills Action Plan will help ensure Scotland has a skilled and productive workforce which is resilient to future economic challenges. And we're continuing to increase investment in R&D and our export plan, which seeks to ensure we're not just fighting back against the impact of Brexit, but targeting key markets and key industries that have real growth potential. We'll of course build on that with the Scottish National Investment Bank. And in terms of people, we aim to combat the potential fall in population as a result of Brexit with campaigns to ensure that EU citizens know Scotland is their home and they're welcome, and efforts to secure an immigration policy that fits Scotland's needs. Finally, the third phase of our approach is longer term, restructuring. That means looking further ahead to try and understand what the economy may look like in the future and prepare for that. This is obviously hard to do in the current uncertain political and economic environment we find ourselves in, but we're ready and prepared to adjust our approach to whatever may come.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. to questions now from committee members. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, my overwhelming impression is that across the whole of the United Kingdom, businesses, financial institutions, professional bodies have been communicating their concerns to the UK government in respect to a no-deal Brexit. Is there any indication that the government is actually listening to these concerns and addressing them?
In terms of the high-level political principle, if they were listening to business, they just would not deliver a no-deal Brexit because it's economically catastrophic. So businesses are saying that it would be catastrophic, it'll cause business failure, dip in exports, soaring unemployment, undo the gains we've made in the economy, and be incredibly damaging as a consequence of all of that. Any form of Brexit will damage the economy. It has a range of impacts that I think are well understood by the committee. But even now, at a political level, the response could be such, in keeping with what Westminster has actually approved in trying to stop a no-deal Brexit. If the government was listening, they would not have a no-deal Brexit. Of course, we have, as a government, pursued an agenda of trying to stay within the European Union. The next best thing would be to have a compromise where we stay within the single market and the customs union. And of course, Scotland has very particular needs within that as well. In terms then, if we are in the worst case scenario of a no-deal Brexit, then the UK government has had to have information essentially leaked from UK government to know what the preparations really look like. And therefore it appears that the UK government isn't fully listening to what business is saying around the demands and pressures that they'll face as a consequence of Brexit. Now, of course, there are preparations underway at a UK and a Scottish level, and we're trying to engage with UK government as to what can be done to mitigate the impact of Brexit. But let me say here at committee, there is no way that the Scottish Government can fully mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit on Scotland's people and economy if that's where the UK Government leave us.
Just to take another angle on this, the Bank of England obviously is a very respected institution, and the estimates that it makes on an analysis of EU withdrawal under a no-deal indicates that UK GDP could reduce by up to 10.5% by 2023. And there's various other scenarios within that, increasing UK unemployment to 7.5%, increasing inflation to 6.5%. Is it at all possible to mitigate against this sort of scenario?
I think I've just tried to make that point, that there is only so much Scottish Government can do. If there is soaring unemployment, clearly there will be a sense in which we are overwhelmed with even what the Skills Agency and colleges and universities and the local authorities and other stakeholders can do just in terms of employment, in terms of the economic impact with that business failure and imports and exports and exchange rate. It's just the economic impact is catastrophic, and I do think that knowing the effort and energy that's gone into very particular industrial interventions over the course of the summer that I and my ministerial colleagues have been engaged with, that no, it's not possible to fully mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit because it will be so harmful to our economy and therefore to our communities, and there's a great deal of economic consensus that will be the case. I think even the Chancellor of the Exchequer struggled to quantify the negative impact on the UK's economy. There's no positive impact of a no-deal Brexit. It is only a negative impact, and it will be catastrophic. There's only so much we can do to mitigate for it, and we have plans in place to try and prepare. I don't know if you wish further analysis or information on the economic forecast, since I have the government's chief economic advisor and economist with me.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I'll just make sure that's on. That's okay, thanks. So I think in a sense, picking up in the Bank of England work, in the most recent forecasts. So the bank revised their forecasts for no deal in light of the increased mitigation that the UK government was putting in place. But as you've just said, the impacts they're still forecasting for GDP and unemployment are negative, with the economy contracting by up to 5.5% and unemployment rising. I think a more interesting one is the OBR forecast from July, based on their fiscal risk report, which looked at a more benign no-deal scenario where there would be many deals for a number of sectors. And their projections suggested that even in that scenario, you would see growth in the UK economy contracting through 2020 by about 1.4%. And actually the public finances been hit by up to 20 billion. The key point around the different modelling and forecasts, the initial work that we published for the government looked at the impact of Brexit on the economy going out to 2030. And essentially that's based on a transition, sectors adjusting, and essentially by 2030 the economy is a percentage smaller than it would have been under the status quo. What you have with no deal is the disorderly impact, it's the immediate change, and that's what front loads the risks, and that dislocation of the economy immediately through both supply side constraints, whether it's transport regulatory, whether it's businesses being prepared, or through the demand side where there's a collapse in confidence. So that's really what all of the forecasters are really worried about, that immediate impact and the known unknowns around how that will play out.
I wonder if I might come in at this point and move from these forecasts, which vary from time to time and depending on who's giving them, to the specifics of what the Scottish Government is doing and has done to assist Scottish businesses with the specific consequences of a no-deal Brexit, in terms of which we would be on within the system of the WTO, World Trade Organization rules. So to some, those rules might be advantageous, to others disadvantageous. So what specifically has the Scottish Government done in terms of preparation for Scottish companies for that?
Convener, we've been engaging with the business representative organisations, convening with the Banking and Economy Forum, because of course most companies will engage with their bank in terms of any pressures that we face. So we've been building up that intelligence. We've been responding to requests for support through the Prepare for Brexit website, where we can do the diagnostics and advise companies and anything they might be able to do to prepare for Brexit. And I gave the figures in my opening remarks in terms of that website. It's not just a website, it's actually a call centre and a whole team that brings together the different enterprise agencies together, as I say, to try and come up with a bespoke package of support for individual companies based in Clydebank, the call centre. But it is largely online. So the call centre works together to bring together different parts of government to give support to individual companies. As I say, there's a diagnostic tool for companies, there's financial support available to businesses to prepare for Brexit. And then the enterprise agencies have been engaging with businesses individually as well. But it's fair to say, because it's unknown what the political outcome is going to be, companies have been finding it difficult to fully prepare. Larger companies have organised their affairs, and particularly financial services have reorganised their affairs in such a fashion that they feel, whilst they don't like it, they might feel better prepared than many SMEs. So there is an issue about small and medium-sized enterprises, many of whom don't have a plan for Brexit, but that's why we've tried to promote the Prepare for Brexit campaign, the tools that are available, the advice, the support, the expertise, and then there's specific grants available. In terms of our own preparations for the 31st of October, if we are in the territory of a no-deal Brexit, as I say, we have 3 phases. There is recovery, resilience, and then ultimately the restructuring of the economy, because some sectors will have less growth or more impact as a consequence of Brexit than others. But immediately on recovery, we will essentially have a kind of triage arrangement where we have the support. We would refer people, signpost them to the banks, but we'll also have government financial products that can assist with businesses. In terms of unemployment and retraining and upskilling, Skills Development Scotland and our colleges would be involved. Scottish Funding Council will also help ensure that there are resources reorganised to support packages for businesses to adapt as well in terms of workforce and labour supply issues, because we are concerned about the skills gap. And of course, PACE would be involved where there are redundancies in the usual fashion, where PACE intervenes around support where there have been redundancies made. So as I say, there are a range of options. The scale at which each deployed will be determined by available resources, what the UK government's doing around their own interventions, and also where demand is at the time. Because as Gary has just touched upon, sectors will be affected differently, so we'll have to tailor the approach based on the intelligence that we have at that point in time. And we also have an economic dashboard that helps us understand what's going on in the economy and therefore where we should target our efforts as best we can. In terms of the rural economy, and of course agriculture will have its own very specific challenges here. I'm sure Fergus Ewan could tell you more about the rural economy and the issues in relation to support around farming, but a headline within farming would be to point out that we've advanced the loan scheme so that there's a fiscal injection by way of loan payments to the farming community as well. So that's just a taste of some of the preparations that we've been making, as well as engaging with UK government around areas that are both reserved, that will have an impact on devolved functions as well, not least on transport and logistics.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, your officials may be able to help on this, but have analyses been done of which companies, as you say, some will be affected more than others? It's dependent, although it's also dependent on economic conditions, but have they done analyses that could be shared with the committee, for example?
Absolutely. Some has already been published, but I'm happy if you would like more from our analysis, of course.
Just to say, the government published No Deal Brexit analysis in February. I appeared at the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee in March and gave evidence on the impacts. And we took, just to give you an example of the sectors, we took Bank of England work around the sectors most likely to be impacted by a no deal. That was based on sectors that would either dependent on EU labour, borders issues, regulation or transport or logistics. And the sectors with the potential impact in Scotland were agriculture, forestry and fishing, chemicals, food and drink and construction. So that was the key lights, but we can provide that to the committee also. And can I just make a point around the Prepare for Brexit website? When I was here in March, this site had been launched about a month at the time, and we were seeing a spike in activity. At that time there was something like 32,000 visits to the site, and just over 2,000 companies had done the online assessment tool. I think as of last week we were over 100,000, 106, we over 6,000 completed. So it's starting to really penetrate the business base in Scotland around thinking about how it will impact on them, whether they're frontline trading sectors or they're supplying the economy within.
Right, thank you. We'll come to Willie Coffey now.
Thanks very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, do you think the Prime Minister is seriously trying to get a deal to avoid a no-deal exit? The latest news this morning, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, is to suggest that there could be some kind of customs buffer zones in the north and south of Ireland to overcome the backstop, and it's immediately been rejected by the Irish government. So what's your view in this, and do you think there is a serious attempt to try to get a deal to avoid this situation?
Well, Convener, I don't believe there's a serious effort by the UK government led by Boris Johnson to get a deal. I fear that Boris Johnson is about EU exit at all costs, and the collateral damage will be the economy and the communities of the whole of the UK. And as I understand it this morning, non-papers, I think they're called, from the UK government, the current proposition to address the issue in Northern Ireland has already been rejected out of hand. So we see no evidence that the UK government is genuinely trying to get a deal. Any form of Brexit will be damaging to the UK and the Scottish economy, but no deal particularly catastrophic. And of course that is a great concern to us.
Okay, thank you.
Richard Lyle.
The Cabinet Secretary, the UK Government's own analysis shows that how devastating a no-deal scenario would be for our economy, and yet they still don't think we should rule it out. Disruption to cross-channel trade could lead to delays in UK food supply, 30% of which comes from the EU. 30%. The UK is an island. It has to import certain foods and products. So what's your view in regard to the possible questions being asked regarding the availability of fresh food, reduced and rising prices, which could hit vulnerable groups, petrol import tariffs, which could inadvertently lead to thousands of jobs losses, disruptions to fuel supplies, but the most important, medical supplies, being vulnerable to severe extended delays. 3/4 of UK medicine enters this country through main channel crossings, and many of my constituents are on these drugs that are imported, and I'm concerned about it. But yesterday I was talking to a chap who imports cheese from Ireland, cheese and butter. Presently costs £1,200 a tonne. If Brexit goes ahead, that will rise with tariffs to £2,600 a tonne. Nearly more than double. What's your view, and are we really having a relationship with the UK government and discussing how to prepare to supply and make sure there are no chain disruptions? Because my concern is you'll walk into shops after the 31st of October and there'll be empty shelves.
Convener, we of course are concerned about the impact of a no-deal Brexit for the reasons that we've given on the economy, but of course the impacts are much wider than that, and even when there's reserved areas such as borders and tariffs, the issues are going to manifest themselves in devolved areas like transport and medicines, is the example that's been given by Richard Lyle. And that impact on the economy, that shock, is a concern, and then there's the medium and longer term issues as well. In terms of relationship with UK government, I have to say that sometimes it depends on the Whitehall department. Overall, I don't think there was a proper engagement with the devolved administrations, particularly following the time of the new Prime Minister. Engagement was not as good as it should have been. Now, I think we're getting a bit more involved now in some of the UK infrastructure in terms of preparation, some sharing of information, but it does depend on which UK department, Whitehall department, that you're dealing with. But the member expresses, I think, a very legitimate concern around transport and customs in that regard. Because if the UK government's transport and customs and port strategy isn't right, it will impact on supplies across the UK and to Scotland, and that is a concern, and that's why we're working intensively to try and prepare for that. But we will be dependent on the UK government. Take medicines, for example, those Category 1 supplies, having the necessary rerouting and routing arrangements in place to ensure that, as well as stockpiling, but there's an adequate supply of those medical supplies. And at the moment, I feel as if we are all relying upon the UK government having plans for plans to deliver. And of course, we are posing the question, can you guarantee 100% of supplies will be in place? Now, it's for the UK government to answer how sure they are. They are advising us that they have plans to have plans. But I'm concerned, Convener, about the timescales to have those plans in place to ensure that, take just medicines, that the pharmaceutical companies and distributors and suppliers will know those plans in time and place to make sure there's that proper distribution across the country. So of course it's an immense concern that cliff edge, that no-deal Brexit date will be delivered in a fashion that causes so much disruption. In terms of the economy, maybe Kevin Quinlan will say a bit more on tariffs as it affects Scottish business and trade as well, because that's a very particular question, of course, around those sectors that will be impacted, and particularly in agriculture, that the committee may well wish to be cited on.
So on tariffs specifically, so there's obviously areas within this which are within our control, there's areas which are not. The setting of tariffs obviously is not. We have engaged in a very concerted manner with UKG around this. I guess there's a couple of issues. One is the shock value, tariffs being introduced overnight, and therefore having a very immediate effect without private sector suppliers having an ability to be able to adjust. I think some of the tariffs that we're looking at are also quite complicated. I've got pages of schedules here in the notes. If we look up the West Coast industries, langoustines 12%, prawns 18%, fresh salmon 2%, smoked salmon 13%. So it's a very complicated regime. In addition to that, I think there are some areas which we are able to do something about. So one is the areas of export health certificates in relation to the exports of, again, seafood products from the West Coast. We have come up with a Scottish solution to that to ensure that some of the regulatory barriers are not impeding. But I think overall, I think it will have a very significant impact. We have a situation where the most important point is that Europe, in the absence of a trade deal, won't change its tariffs, so we will face the same level of tariffs that we have now. The tariffs that were announced in April by UKG mean that we will have very drastic liberalisation. I think between 87 and 95% of all of our imports will be subject to a complete sort of tariff-free situation. The probably notable exceptions are in relation to sheep. So there the tariff regime will be between 40 and 60%, but still very significant competition, and beef where it will be 100%.
So for Scotland, overnight, exporting to Europe, we're going to pay between 2 and 12% more.
Yep.
And coming in, basically, we as the public are going to pay more for stuff coming in from Europe or basically from elsewhere. So that's the concern I've got. But also I have one more concern, Cabinet Secretary. EU nationals, and the long debate over you can remain, you can stay, you can go, you can pay, you don't need to pay, but still people are now, I see people drifting away to go home, back to their country, and I want them to stay. I welcome people to come to Scotland, I welcome people to live in Scotland, I welcome people to think. My mother-in-law was Dutch, my father-in-law was Lithuanian. As I said last week in the Chamber, if they hadn't come here, I wouldn't have met my wife, I wouldn't have had my kids, I wouldn't have had my grandkids. And it angers me that we have a situation where basically we're telling people to go home. Sorry, their home is here, and I want them to stay. What action are we also taking against basically a UK government driving people away from their homes, which is Scotland?
Well, Convener, we've tried to, and I concur with what Richard Lyle has said, we've tried to create a political environment that is in sharp contrast with the UK political environment that's tried to create a hostile environment to immigrants and to immigration. In Scotland, we recognise the contribution that immigration has played to our communities and our diversity and our economy. And that's why we are encouraging people to stay. Scotland is their home. And if we are privileged enough for people to choose to come and live here and contribute, then we want them to stay. So we've been doing that at a political level, and we've been also running campaigns about stay in Scotland. People are welcome, and we've tried to show our pro-internationalist and pro-European credentials. And we've been working with the business community to project that message that we want people to stay. The UK clearly has particular bureaucratic and administrative arrangements in terms of settled status that requires people to register, essentially. But we have been running campaigns to stay in Scotland, and we welcome people from the rest of the UK as well, of course, to Scotland. and we'll continue to run those campaigns to make the point that people are welcome to stay. We've also tried to support businesses in retaining their workforce, because that's a key point about those, and Richard Lyle mentioned this, those who might be choosing to leave. It might be the exchange rate, it might be that more hostile environment that the UK government has created. But you know, I think most people get that Scotland's different. There's a point of difference here, that the attitudes in Scotland are that we want immigrants to stay, and our future population growth can only come from, is projected only to come from, inward migration. So for economic reasons, social reasons, then we want to encourage people to stay, and that's why we've been running those campaigns and trying to support businesses and make it as easy as possible for people to stay. I think there's been one victory of late in terms of UK immigration policy, and that was the decision to allow people to stay the post-study work visa. And I think it speaks to the point that our economic needs require inward migration, and we want to see a much more welcoming UK policy around immigration. And if you don't want to change UK policy, then be sensitive to Scotland's needs and give us the tools to be able to create the right migration policy for Scotland, because there's no doubt about it, with that shrinking potential, that shrinking working age population, we need more people to keep delivering our services and help us grow our economy in a sustainable way. But Scottish Government's done everything we can to try and encourage people to stay, and that will continue into the future.
Thank you. And I'd remind members we're slightly tight for time, and we appreciate the Cabinet Secretary generously giving of his time. I think we're possibly running a bit longer than you had anticipated. So a brief follow-up from Dean Lockhart and then Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up with the Cabinet Secretary in terms of what the Scottish Government is doing for business. Can you tell me how much additional funding has specifically been allocated to the enterprise agencies to prepare for Brexit, just in terms of a pound number in terms of additional funding?
Well, like many other parts of the public sector, we're expecting them to recalibrate and ensure that energies are directed towards the Brexit challenge. Promoting Scotland internationally was 1.4 million. The Prepare for Brexit campaign was 1.1 million. The advice service and community-based support for EU citizens was 0.5 million. So there's a couple of examples. I'd take the Prepare for Brexit campaign, because the question was specifically Scottish enterprise, £1.1 million. So that was the amount to support and help the Prepare for Brexit campaign that I referenced earlier.
So ballpark numbers, without being too precise, about 2.5 million, £3 million has been spent by the Scottish Government to...
So let me check all the figures, because you're asking me for budget lines now, but in terms of the headline commitments, just through those approved spend, then the Prepare for Brexit campaign is £1.1 million, and as I say, Promoting Scotland internationally is 1.4 million.
So out of a Barnett Consequential of roughly £95 million from the UK Government preparing for Brexit, roughly about £2 million has been spent by the Scottish Government to prepare Scottish business for Brexit.
No, that's the question you asked me was a different question. The question you asked me was how much was specifically given to Scottish enterprise. The question as to the totality of support to the business community from as a consequence of Brexit will be greater than that. But you know, I don't think, in fairness, you would have expected me to have had that figure to hand. Do you have a rough idea of what that figure is? I would rather check the detail and come back to committee than just give you a figure off the top of my head. The question you specifically asked me was what Barnett Consequentials had been given to the enterprise agency to prepare for Brexit. The question of how much support is going to the business community as a consequence of Brexit will be a much higher figure, and I'm happy to come back to committee on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. The EU market of 500 million people is very important to the Scottish economy. But what I wanted to ask you about was the EU trade agreements with over 70 countries, and whether the UK government has had any discussions with you about what happens at the end of the transition period in December 2020 when those agreements come to an end, as far as the UK is concerned.
I mean, again, I can ask Kevin Quinlan to cover more, because Kevin will work in between ministers and also Michael Russell, who's leading with UK government in terms of negotiations. I was quite looking forward, believe it or not, to next Monday when I was to be meeting the business secretary in the UK government, and I imagine it would have been to discuss the preparations for Brexit. I understand that meeting's been cancelled, which is quite unfortunate, of course, because we should be engaging with UK government as much as we can to try and prepare for Brexit. But Kevin, I think we should say a bit more in terms of engagement with trade officials.
Yeah, obviously this is super important in terms of future trade access. We have been engaging. I think the flow of information was pretty good in the spring in terms of progress that they were making. Since then, there was a leak in Whitehall, not in the Scottish Government, and that flow of information has dwindled to a trickle. We still have some sort of informal heads up. In terms of your specific question, what happens after the transition period, I think by and large at the moment, the Department for International Trade is working on the assumption that those trade agreements will roll over if and when they are signed, and that any renegotiation would happen in slower time. There's a practical problem that they frankly face the challenge of bandwidth to be able to do any substantial renegotiation.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. And brief follow-up from Jamie Halker-Johnson and then Jackie Bailey.
Thanks very much, Convener. You spoke about the government's position in terms of a no-deal Brexit. So can I ask, if there is a deal struck between the EU and the UK, if it is agreed and both parties agree to it, will the Scottish Government's position be to support that deal?
So, to be clear, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson's asking me, will I support a deal that we see no evidence of, no content of, no understanding of, no assessment of? Would it be fair to say that...
What I'm asking you is, if there is a deal that is agreeable to both the EU and to the UK, given the comments that you've made on a no-deal Brexit, will the Scottish Government's position be to support that deal?
Well, if it's a deal that damages Scotland, no, we wouldn't support a deal that damages Scotland. So if there is a deal, not that there's any evidence that there's going to be a deal, if it's Theresa May's deal, or a variant of it, a close variant of it, we know that it will damage Scotland. So we didn't support that deal. No deal Brexit's catastrophic, but if a deal emerges, then of course the Scottish Government would look at it. But our ambition is clear. Ultimately, we want Scotland to stay within the European Union. We want it to stay within the customs union and the single market. If some new political deal is reached, then of course we would look at it. But if it damages Scotland, then why should the Scottish Government support it?
Okay. So are you saying the EU withdrawal agreement that the EU was willing to agree was damaging to Scotland?
That's right. That was Theresa May's deal, yes.
Well, I think it was the EU's agreed offer with her.
Okay, the EU deal with Theresa May was also a deal that damages Scotland. If a new deal emerges between Boris Johnson and the European Union, let's wait and see. I hae my doubts, Convener. But if it damages Scotland, then why should the Scottish Government support it when it's contrary to not just what the Scottish Government thinks, but what the people of Scotland thought when they voted in the referendum to stay within the European Union?
Well, we'll move on from your doubts to Jackie Bailey.
Well, I share the Cabinet Secretary's response to the Convener, but can I take him to something Mike Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitutional Relations, said in the Chamber, and that was that a no-deal Brexit would generate a significant economic shock. Given his new fiscal powers to deal with economic shocks, will the Scottish Government seek to borrow additional funding to meet the crisis that we think Brexit will present?
I think it's a very fair question, Convener, but I would want to relate it to I'll attend the Finance Committee this week as well, and share with the Economy Committee that I have already engaged with Treasury to say that I think the current parameters around our resource borrowing powers are inadequate. And they're partly inadequate because of the information that's coming to light, just in terms of if you take the income tax reconciliation as well, or what we might want to do around the Scottish National Investment Bank and the borrowing parameters there. But then, yes, if you add in volatility as well of Brexit, then I do believe that the current parameters we've got are inadequate. So I think that's a straight bat answer to the question. No, I don't think the powers we have the borrowing powers we have around resource and capital are adequate, especially facing this volatility and this economic difficulty off the back of a no-deal Brexit. In terms of resource borrowing, the Scottish Government, of course, has very modest reserves, essentially at around £135 million just in resource reserves. There are, say, borrowing limits that are in place, but I would refer you to the comments that I made earlier that to execute a no-deal Brexit plan, if the UK doesn't fund it, then we're either reprioritising from within or we'll have to curtail our contingency plans to support our plans. Now that is a concern, and that's why the UK government should fully fund the consequences of a no-deal Brexit. But the borrowing, the financial limits that we work within, I present to Finance Committee and of course at budget time. The UK government is looking at the prospect of, well, a budget. We thought there might be an emergency budget. There wasn't. The UK budget is yet to be set, but I would set out our funding plans at the Scottish budget, and that would give a response to this. But as I say, I already believe that the current parameters that we have around resource and capital borrowing and drawdown from the reserve is far too constricted for the realities that we now face in the fiscal landscape.
It doesn't quite answer my question, so let me just pry again a little bit more. You do have an additional fiscal power negotiated by the previous Finance Secretary with the UK Treasury that in the case of economic shocks you can borrow more money, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Those triggers are met, in my view, or will certainly be met in the context of a no-deal Brexit. I want to push you on whether you are likely to use that revenue stream that's open to you.
So I tried to give a really comprehensive answer because it's a good question, and I'll certainly address that at the Finance Committee and in the subsequent budget. So let's separate out the two things. What I'm saying is, first of all, before we come to those economic shock, as it's described, resource borrowing limits, the first one is, would I be able to borrow more to fund no-deal preparations? And I suppose that's what I was trying to answer, that be very limited so to do, because the Scottish Government's budget and the Parliament has approved that budget, and unless there's extra resource coming to Scotland, we can't fully fund the no-deal plan. And I'm already describing, I believe, that the volatility we're facing because of a number of matters, I think already suggests that the UK government should be more flexible in our borrowing powers. Separate to that, so I think I tried to give an honest answer on that, analysing the situation, because it's a fair question to say, you know, how can you fund some of the no-deal Brexit preparation, the no-deal impact if UK government's not going to do that, and that would curtail what we can do around mitigation. Separate to that, we haven't yet met the criteria for that component part of resource borrowing as a consequence of the economy. SFC, of course, make a judgment on that as well. If we do, and that's the question, if there is divergence from the rest of the UK, then that would then call into question, and then the ability to borrow against that economic divergence point. Of course, the fear might be that the UK is in recession as well, so their GDP might be impacted as well as Scotland's, whereas the fiscal framework's parameters was that relative position, was it not, the relative position between the UK and Scotland? So I think that gives us further cause for Treasury to look again at the parameters around resource and capital borrowing that will allow us to deal with an economic shock. And I think the way the arrangements were set out is a Scotland-only shock, whereas I think the point that Jackie Bailey's driving at is, well, an economic shock's an economic shock, and how can we have more tools and more levers to pull in that scenario? It won't be just Scotland in economic shock, so to speak, it will be the UK as well. And I think that's why I've tried to open up the debate with Treasury. There's a new Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I know he's catching up with his brief at the moment, but I've tried to engage with Treasury at the first meeting I had at the Finance Ministers' Quadrilateral to try and take these issues forward. Of course, first call on UK Government was to fully resource Brexit preparations and then impact to try and ensure that there's no net detriment to Scotland's finances, both in terms of what government can do, and of course they have a responsibility to intervene in terms of protecting the economy as well. So I think it's a fair question, and I hope that the UK Government will consider these requests.
Can I pursue the money already allocated for Brexit with the Cabinet Secretary very quickly, Convener? 37 million in 2018-19, 55 million 2019-20, another 40 million announced by the Chancellor on the 31st of July. Could you provide committee with the full breakdown for 1920 by portfolio? You did so for me in answer to a question about 2018-19, but said you couldn't provide it for 1920. This strikes me as rather strange, so I'm happy if you would write to the committee with that breakdown. In that written response, could you separate out, if it's possible to do so, that money that's been spent on no-deal preparation as opposed to generally Brexit preparation? And finally, you've made a bid for a further £52 million from the contingency fund, which I'm supportive of, but could you tell us how this is broken down?
Okay, Convener, I'll try and be as helpful as possible. First of all, it's true to say that in terms of the Brexit consequentials, they've been allocated to support that preparedness. If there's a no-deal Brexit, the consequentials so far will come nowhere close to actually resourcing the response to a no-deal Brexit. I can itemise those areas not right now, and I don't think we have time either, Convener, based on what you've said to me earlier. The preparedness resources that have been allocated, for example, to police numbers or Brexit support to businesses, or indeed fair share funding as well, which will help tackle food insecurity. So there's a range of areas I can return to in terms of the current Brexit consequentials, and all of that show how that has been resourced. Of the £98.7 million EU exit consequentials received between 2017-18 and 2019-20, we've already spent or committed £92 million of that £98.7 million. On the request for the £52 million from the UK Government's £1 billion operational contingency fund, which is to help us prepare for a no-deal outcome, there was very strict, very tight criteria for that, which is when we worked at pace to produce a bid for that. This request includes funding to support the disproportionate effect of no deal on rural communities, including ensuring medical support reaches these areas, increased demand on Marine Scotland compliance activities around Scotland's coastline, additional communications to EU citizens living in Scotland, increased demands on Police Scotland, and also poverty mitigation measures to support financially vulnerable households. So that's the nature of the £52 million bid that's in with Treasury at this point in time.
Thank you, Convener.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for coming in, and that concludes our session for today. I'll suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses. we come now to item 4 on our agenda, which is the Consumer Scotland Bill. And joining us today, we have a number of witnesses from my left to right. First of all, Norman Kerr, Director of Energy Action Scotland. Then Thomas Docherty, who is the Head of Public Affairs, Nations and Regions for Which. Thank you for coming in, both of you. And also to Jonathan Linton, who is the Ombudsman, or from the Ombudsman Services. So thank you to all three for coming in today. If I might start with Jackie Bailey has some questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. And can I declare an interest for the record as the Honorary Vice President of Energy Action Scotland? But it doesn't mean that I agree with Norman Kerr on everything. So can I maybe kick off for the panel and ask a very simple question? Do we need Consumer Scotland? And I'd be curious to know how you think it can provide any additionality over the work of existing consumer bodies on consumer issues. Start with Norman Kerr.
Thank you, Jackie. I think the simple answer, Convener, is no, we don't believe it will add much to the landscape. I think others have said it will tighten the landscape. We're not convinced on that. I believe what this bill is trying to do is provide additional powers that could easily have been given to citizens' advice at the time when Consumer Futures, Consumer Focus was disbanded, and citizens' advice across Great Britain was to take on their responsibilities. Energy Action Scotland argued that citizens' advice should be accountable and should be accountable to Parliament, and in that respect Parliament then would have a duty to approve its work plan to receive such reports that would be there for consumer detriment. This is simply trying to replicate that. Our worry is that it muddies the consumer landscape. Consumers already have a fairly wide choice of people to discuss problems with, and unless the new body also takes on a role of consumer education, which I think we can all agree is lacking, then I don't believe it adds much to the landscape at all.
Thank you very much. Thomas Docherty.
We take the reverse position. I mean, where we agree with Norman. So it's probably worth, Jackie, just going back to the very start and saying, in 2015, when the powers were first proposed coming out of the Smith Commission for devolution, the original proposal from the Scottish Government was to create a single body. But actually, CAS, ourselves, the other members of the independent working group, said that wasn't the way to do it. Now, that might not be everyone's position, but as a starting point, and I'm happy subsequently to explain why that was, but almost from the start, it was felt that having two distinct bodies with two clear remits was the way to go forward. We are huge admirers of what Citizens Advice Scotland does in terms of financial well-being, in terms of tackling things like fuel poverty, around welfare, benefits, citizens' advice, in terms of immigration and employment rights. Those are all things that it will continue to do. What Consumer Scotland will do is it will focus purely on those issues which are within the consumer landscape. And it's worth remembering that Scottish consumers per month spend over £8 billion. And in order to spend that money, they've got to have confidence that the markets they are transacting in are working for them. We know that in too many markets, that is not the case. Some of those are reserved, some of those are devolved markets. And we think there is, as does, frankly, almost everybody who made a submission, is that there is clearly gaps in the environment. What I think as well the Scottish Government has done rightly is, rather than saying there is just these gaps here, so we're going to squeeze in a new body without touching the sides of anybody else who's doing things, they've done, in our view, the right thing. They've had a look across the board and said, what responsibilities should move from other organisations to Consumer Scotland? And what they have done is they've created a system which, in our view, is bold. it is brave, but it's logical as well. So when organisations like ourselves look at the two new bodies, it is clear which of them does what, and also alongside that, what organisations like Trading Standards Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland will be doing.
Jonathan Menton.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the in the consumer landscape in Scotland. What I will say is, looking at the complaints that we deal with, there's clearly a complaint class that's unique to Scotland. We receive a different set of complaints from Scottish consumers as opposed to the rest of the UK. In our communication scheme, for example, availability of broadband, speed of broadband, mobile signal availability, particularly in rural areas, really stands out in the data when we look at that for Scottish consumers. So we can see the argument for setting up a consumer advocate who focuses on those types of issues for Scottish consumers. I think we'll also say that we are doing some work at the moment with one of the working groups set up to look at the data strategy for Consumer Scotland. Actually, we see some quite exciting things going on there. So the group are looking to bring data together from numerous different organisations, including ourselves, the Financial Ombudsman, Advice Direct Scotland, and commercial organisations like Trustpilot and Resolver, to bring a much better picture about the consumer journey and where detriment is occurring. We're looking at standardising data sets across those different organisations and then bringing them together to understand the experience of consumers. We think that's really innovative. We haven't seen any other organisations doing that kind of work. We think it could be the model of cross-organisational data sharing in the future. So we can see some positives.
Okay. Can I take you on to something that I think it was Thomas Docherty mentioned, that this isn't just about filling gaps, this is about providing something more coherent strategically. On that basis, do you see any problems or any potential problems that the existence of Consumer Scotland will reduce public funding available to other consumer organisations? If they're going to be doing part of the job that others currently do you think others will lose money?
Other organisations.
Like Citizens Advice Scotland.
So let's talk about Citizens Advice Scotland. It will not lose any money either for its cab network or for the work it does around citizens' advice issues. That money is not being touched. It would be an interesting argument to say we are going to have a new Consumer Scotland body, but we're also then going to fund a second body to also spend taxpayers' money doing the very things that the first body is doing. I mean, I think that doesn't make sense. So clearly, yes, money that is given to Citizens Advice Scotland, and I think in the financial memorandum they've submitted, convener, to the Finance Committee, they've put that figure at about 1.52 million of money will move from Citizens Advice Scotland to Consumer Scotland, because that is the money they are given by the Scottish Government for looking at consumer issues. Not for example, fuel poverty.
In effect, what you're describing is displacement rather than additionality.
No. So if you look at the promoters, sorry, the financial memorandum, the total budget for Consumer Scotland, and I do it top of my head, it's about 1.9 million in that area, and we have sought clear assurances which we've been given, and I'm conscious you've got the Minister coming next month, so I'm sure you'll challenge him on this, that there will be a real term increase in funding on the Consumer Scotland. So it's not just taking the 1.52 million, it's taking the 1.52 million, putting in additional funding to deliver a first-class consumer research and advocacy body.
Norman Kerr, any views?
I'm glad to hear that no funding will be displaced, but I don't see how we can make that commitment just now, and I know colleagues at Citizens Advice are deeply, deeply concerned that perhaps for a short period of time, maybe the first year, that they will see no change, but after that, that money will be ripped away from them.
Can I ask one further question? This is more about brand, and then I'll stop, convener, because I'm conscious of time. Citizens Advice Scotland, with their network of citizens advice bureaus, are a recognised and trusted brand, certainly in my local community, and I suspect all of yours. Consumer Scotland is brand new, it's a government agency. Do you not think that actually giving the Citizens Advice Scotland network the powers actually plays better with where consumers are just now?
Because forgive me, Jackie, I think it's two different brands. I think a much better question is Citizen Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland. That's where that... Sorry.
I ask the questions, you give the answers. Don't tell me what's a better question.
Okay. Will it be... Well, will it be a... Well, bluntly, that's not the right comparison, because Consumer Scotland isn't going to be delivering advocacy services. Advice Direct Scotland is already, since the 1st of April, delivering those advice services in telephony, in online, in social media. The Consumer Scotland isn't trying to be a brand like that, and if frankly it was, then I think this committee might have some questions about spending of public money. Its job is to do research, identify areas of consumer detriment, will be research, identify areas of consumer detriment, investigate what's causing those problems, propose solutions, and then advocate to regulators, businesses, Scottish Government and UK Government how those problems should be fixed. The delivery of advice services is Advice Direct Scotland and CABS.
Okay, Mr Lenton or Mr Kerr, anything to add?
I think I would add to that while we see a new body, and I take what Thomas Docherty is saying about the research, Citizens Advice Scotland already does research. It should already try to influence, in terms of Citizens Advice, GB, the UK Parliament, and much of what we're talking about here in terms of telephony or dealing with broadband speeds or dealing with energy suppliers will continue to be within the remit of the retained powers at Westminster, as I understand it. So therefore this new body will have no teeth other than to make recommendations to ministers, to ask ministers to then make recommendations to the UK Parliament. I don't believe it will deliver that.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Richard Lyle.
Yeah, on that, basically, you know, can you answer this question? Do you think the duty to collaborate, which appears on the bill, or in the bill, is sufficient to ensure that Consumer Scotland does not duplicate the work of other consumer bodies like councils, trade and standards officers, citizen advice? What's your view?
The issue on collaboration is one that I think is definitely needed. Collaboration is always good. However, if that collaboration relies on the goodwill of others, and in Energy Action Scotland submission, we note excuse me, of local agencies such as South Seeds and Greener Kirkcaldy, who are very much boots on the ground in those areas. If that relies solely on goodwill, then it's very hit and miss, because those organisations have already seen funding pulled from them, and the more funding we pull from small local, and we're not talking about the million or so that are now being taken away from Citizens Advice, we're talking about the funding that those small local organisations have got. If that collaboration is based on goodwill from a government agency that holds all of the funding, then those smaller organisations still need funding. They still need to fund premises. They still need to fund volunteers. So we're asking them to collaborate, but not in any way making any recompense to them.
Who funds my local citizens advice?
It's the local authority that funds that.
Exactly, it's the council, it's not the government. So no. if any money is getting ripped away, it's local government, it's through localism that local government would have ripped that away. Now, that's not a question I want to ask you. Basically, at the end of the day, well, no, it's true. You know, the physical situation is, and I was a councillor, you know that, Norman. Yep. Right, councils allocate, through localism, allocate money to whoever they wish. But I want to get back to the consumer. So if I go in and I buy a wonky television, and I go to Citizen Advice, and they can't help me, because we generally sometimes find that some companies don't react to some people. So they don't react to citizen advice. I then complain to Ombudsman about them if I can, right? And they might not listen to them. Sometimes people don't listen to you even. I've came across that in the past. But if I then go to Consumer Scotland and people go, oh, wait a minute, that's Consumer Scotland. They're tied up to the Scottish Government. We better sit up and... do you not agree that sometimes going to different people, even people come to MSPs, can sometimes get a reaction, and most of the time get a reaction? Do you not agree that depending on who you go to, you might get a reaction?
I think I'd take you back to what Thomas Docherty said earlier. Consumer Scotland will not be doing frontline advocacy. They will be doing in-depth research and looking at consumer detriment. They will not intervene in individual cases. That's my take on it. Yeah. So therefore, for
my take on it,
then I think the bill needs to be explicit in that. And if it is explicit, then it needs to show what the link between the already consumer landscape is. Because the organisations I mentioned, Greener Kirkcaldy and South Seeds, receive funding from the Scottish Government, not from the local authorities. So while we're talking about ripping funding away, it's not local authorities that are ripping funding away. They are already under strain. And if you look at citizens' advice, there used to be 8 citizens' advice bureaus in Glasgow. There are now 5 because the local authority has taken the funding away.
Yeah, the local authority took the funding away. Thank you.
I know my colleagues will disagree.
Do they? Thomas Docherty?
I mean, look, I mean, I accept that frankly, the Scottish Government and the Minister, when he comes next month, is going to have to do some explaining to people. But I say this again, it's not taking away money from those frontline organisations because it's not doing that job. That's specifically what it's not doing, convener. It's not seeking. I mean, its total headcount is going to be somewhere between 16 and 20 in the memorandum they've been submitted. Any suggestion that it could deliver a face-to-face advocacy service would be as ludicrous as Citizens Advice Scotland trying to set up a rival telephony advice scheme to Advice Direct Scotland. That's just not what its purpose is. It is, and also, I mean, the other thing, sorry, very, very briefly, is I think we need to be really clear. People who go to Citizens Advice bureaus are not going on standalone consumer issues. That is not what they are. They are going. I mean, a really good example will be Thomas Cook last week, where ourselves at Which and Advice Direct Scotland had huge numbers of hits onto our website, social media, and so on, with people with consumer queries about their rights, and they would have been going to Ombudsman services as well. Those customers won't be walking into Citizens Advice bureaus in any number whatsoever to have that kind of conversation, because that's just not what people do. The staff who've lost their jobs might very well be coming in, convener, to get advice about where they stand financially, and that's the brilliant job that Citizens Advice Scotland does and will continue to do for the future. That's the very clear divide.
Councils, rents, council tax, benefits, you name it. You name it. My experience is they'll deal with it.
Mm-hmm. If Jonathan Lenton wants to comment on this, and then we'll move on to questions from Colin Beattie.
I think I'll just add to what's been said, that Ombudsman Services, we talk about strategic redress. So as well as helping the individual, we look at how can we work with other organisations to improve the consumer experience. So there's probably 4 pillars of consumer protection. That is advice, advocacy, enforcement and redress. How those organisations work together can determine, you know, how the consumer experience can be improved. To be honest, has that worked brilliantly well in the past? I would say probably not. I think we are improving as a group of organisations. So, for example, now in energy, we have a tripartite arrangement with Citizens Advice UK and Ofgem, and we get together every month and we look at our data and we identify issues that are causing detriment to consumers, and then we put a plan together in terms of what are we going to do as the ADR provider, what are Citizens Advice going to do as the advice provider, what are Ofgem going to do as the regulator. And I think that kind of more coordinated approach, we think, looking at the intention of Consumer Scotland, that organisation can really add to that type of conversation.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me ask you a very simple question. Does this bill give Consumer Scotland the necessary powers to carry out its role?
Yes.
Why?
Because because of what it is intending to do. It intends to be a research body, an investigatory body, and important to stress, I don't mean looking at an individual transaction or an individual company even. It's looking at investigations of markets. It's going to be developing policy, and it's then going to be advocating on behalf of consumers to those organisations. You could add some additional powers, Mr. Beattie, if you wished it to do additional things around, there's a question about super complaints, for example. But in terms of those 4 tasks that it is set out to do, and the things it's not trying to do, then I think it has the right balance of powers.
Do the other witnesses have a view?
We just point to the good work that Citizens Advice did a year or so ago on highlighting the loyalty penalty. So Citizens Advice found that customers who stay with companies for a period tend to pay more than new customers, and within that, vulnerable customers are more likely to stay with their service provider. So they are a group who are significantly impacted upon those things, and it's that kind of work that we expect Consumer Scotland to be doing for Scottish consumers. And I think that work that Citizens Advice has had big ramifications in some of the sectors that we're involved in, so we can see an impact in the energy sector and impact in the communication sector, with policymakers looking at the research and doing something about it.
But to repeat the question, do you think the bill gives Consumer Scotland the necessary powers to carry out its role?
Again, this is probably not my area of expertise. I think the one thing we like in the bill is the fact that it places an expectation on public bodies to take into account the impact on consumers of any future changes to the law. And I think that's pretty good. I don't know what my fellow panel members think.
Yeah, it's the first part of the UK to do that. Convener, we were huge champions of that. We did have some difficult conversations on occasions with the Minister, but he has been really supportive, and we think that's a really important step forward.
I suppose the biggest lack, if you look at the powers of Consumer Scotland, they don't have any enforcement powers. Is that a problem?
No, because it's not trying to be an enforcement body. So I think that's, again, I pivot back. Because it's not trying to be an enforcement body, it does not need enforcement powers, which is not an enforcement body. Citizens Advice Scotland is not an enforcement body. We are advocates. We do research, we do advocacy, so we aren't trying to step onto the toes of others.
But I did see a head nod there about from...
then I come back to my original point. What is it for? If it has no enforcement powers, we already have organisations like the CMA, like Trading Standards, who have that. If this is just another research body that seeks to influence, then I'm sorry, but in my view, we already have that across the consumer landscape.
Sorry, I'm just wondering if I could just briefly interject there. Thomas Doherty, I think in the Which submission to the committee, you say the proposed bill provides Consumer Scotland with the necessary powers to adequately represent consumer interest and achieve its stated aim of improving support for Scottish people. Just to be clear, you don't consider any enforcement powers or actual powers to make anything happen are necessary for it to achieve those aims? No. Because, so what are its powers then?
So because I say, sorry to repeat myself, it is not trying to act like a trading standards body. It's not trying to act like a regulator. So those would be the two areas, I think, in particular, where you would need enforcement powers. what it's trying to do is look at where. So, I'll give you 3 or 4 examples, convener. Banking services, access to cash, legal services, telecoms and rail. None of those issues have had any attention from a consumer body within Scotland in recent years. And, members of this committee have tabled many questions and raised the quality of services in their area. Those are within those are the types of things that we've identified that Consumer Scotland could look at where the problem are and come up with solutions. There is an argument going forward around this question of super complaints. If that was something that subsequently it was felt to be useful, but fundamentally we think it is the right balance.
Come back to Colin Beattie.
Just still following the line of what Consumer Scotland should or shouldn't do, would you like to see Consumer Scotland do anything in particular in the area of consumer redress?
We would like to see there are a number of areas of consumer markets where access to ADR schemes, to ombudsman schemes, is not compulsory, where the detriment, we believe, is severe. I would hope that, because obviously there are so many areas that you could choose to focus on, that in the first couple of years it might carry out an investigation into how Scottish consumers are affected by not having a right to automatic ADR in some of those schemes.
Yeah, I think we've got some experience of offering ADR in unregulated sectors. We opened the Consumer Ombudsman in 2015 following the introduction of new regulations that required all traders to offer or to make customers aware of ADR, but traders were never compelled to use the ADR scheme that they inform their consumers about. So actually, without...
Can I just interrupt there, because the question was whether you would like to see Consumer Scotland do anything in particular in the area of consumer redress.
So from my point of view, I didn't anticipate that Consumer Scotland would act as a redress body, but as Thomas said, I think that there are areas of in business sectors where the lack of redress causes problems for consumers. So I would reiterate that I think it would be an interesting area for Consumer Scotland to explore, but as I said, I wouldn't anticipate Consumer Scotland necessarily being the redress organisation themselves.
Follow-up from Jamie Halkwood-Johnston and then on to Gordon MacDonald.
Convener, morning to the panel, afternoon to the panel. A couple of the points were raised about the banking situation, say, regards to banking. I mean, which themselves have done a report on Scottish banking. So it has been covered. Obviously, the Scottish Affairs Committee have done an inquiry into banking and bank closures. This committee have done an inquiry into bank closures. So there is coverage of this issue. There is research into the problem. There are solutions, or suggestions. Let's maybe solutions is too far, coming through that. And also, I think you mentioned the loyalty penalty work done by Citizens Advice, which in no way am I suggesting, trying to be negative about. But we've known for a number of years that there's an issue that if you stay with one supplier, you lose out. I'm struggling to see where an organisation like the ones that's being proposed provides additional opportunities to that at the moment, because those things that you've highlighted, actually there are organisations covering to some extent.
I had a wonderful morning giving evidence to this committee, I think about 18 months ago, convener, on this issue of banking, which is why I raised it. And if you recall at the time, I said that whilst we had produced some statistics that said we had some what I call what statistics, so what had been the loss of branches, and we've put up new information as well that in the last 5 years alone, a third of branches have gone from Scotland. But there hasn't been any work done as to why, and there hasn't been, and as I said to the committee, there hasn't been work done as to what's the longer term impact. So that's, I think, those are in particular. So it's all very well having statistics, and actually, frankly, we have no shortage of statistics. And organisations like ourselves can produce you lots and lots of numbers, but it's the digging down to do that investigation that has been missing at the moment.
I mean, do you not think that the work of this committee and the Scottish Affairs Committee at Westminster should be doing that, coming up with those recommendations? I mean, that's what we do. We take evidence from organisations like yourselves, the banks, etc., from different consumer groups, different individuals, and come forward with suggestions or solutions.
So to carry out a substantive piece of work to investigate, using banking as just as an example, but this equally applies to telecoms or to rail, whatever else. Our advice to the Scottish Government is that based on the work that we have done, which of course we fund ourselves, we're not a publicly funded body, we take no money from the taxpayer, to do a substantive piece of work to actually get into the problem in Scotland would be 6 figures. Now, this committee doesn't have 6 figures to spend on that type of in-depth research, and that would include doing some market research, some polling, doing some focus groups in, say, the Highlands and Islands, doing one in Edinburgh, convener, doing one in Kilmarnock, for say, that kind of actually understanding what everyday finances people are trying to use. That's work that is not currently being done, and then proposing solutions. And then campaigning. So that's the bit about the advocacy, is the then campaigning. So this committee made some brilliant, really thoughtful recommendations to UK and Scottish ministers, many of which we are disappointed that so far neither government has chosen to take up. And that ongoing advocacy work is the bit that Consumer Scotland should be doing.
Okay, thank you.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just to continue the discussion about the research aspect of things, consumers, when they've got a problem, they might go to citizens' advice, they might go to trading standards, they might phone up Which for advice, or in my constituency there is the one-stop shop, which isn't aligned with any of the other organisations. And I'm just wondering, is there that wealth of case history that's out there, is there any other organisation pulling all of that together to identify trends, problems, areas that should be investigated? I take it the answer's no then. No. So there is a need for a body that will do that type of work. Now, in order to do so, it has to have the agreement of all of these organisations to share that data. Is there any issues that would stop an organisation from sharing that data?
I don't believe there would be an issue sharing the data. It's how anonymised the data would need to be. And I think that in terms of organisations already collecting data and their GDPR, then it's, if they're not already collecting the data that can be anonymised, then it's what do they do with all of the old stuff. So I think it's the preparation of that data to give to an alternative body, a new body, that may be something that would require quite a little bit of work.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I have a meeting, I don't know if you're at it as well, on Thursday afternoon. The Scottish Government's got a data working group just actually digging in, Mr MacDonald, exactly to that point about, well, what would you need to do? I mean, we already share data, exactly as Norman says, on taking out the individual data, say individual details of people. It's the trends that are crucial. So it's not about one person's had a bad experience of buying a used car. The stuff that ADS is collecting that shows large numbers of people having problems with used cars, or lots of people having problems with furniture, I think was another common one as well. That kind of pulling it together is really important.
Could there be a role for the organisation? I'm aware that there isn't a recall database, for instance, in the UK, of whether it's happened to be cars or Which had a campaign recently about tumble dryers, I think it was. Is there a need for an organisation to highlight to consumers all of the recall issues or all of the concerns that they have in research? We talked about consumer education earlier on. I mean, Which has been very good over the years at promoting best buy products, etc. And there doesn't seem to be a general information out there for organisations unless you're a Wix subscriber. Is there a need for that type of information out there?
Yes. Definitely.
What I would add to that, though, is if you look at the size and shape that's been proposed for the organisation, 20 staff, budget of £2.5 million, that's a lot of issues that we're already mounting up to put on an organisation of that size to create the database that you've got, that you want, as well as getting the cooperation of a myriad of other organisations. So if we want the organisation to do that, then I think we need to be very explicit within the bill about the role that it has and be more realistic about a budget. Thomas talked about a 6-figure budget for research. £2.5 million, you're not going to get much research each year from an organisation of that size, if that's the kind of money that we're talking about.
But it could have a database that was signposting in the early days until it built up to the point where it became some form of database. It could act as a signposting organisation to start with.
I mean, that's absolutely crucial. That's one of the things, Convener, that the Scottish Government has been very clear on, and that we've all said, that it is a confusing landscape, pardon me, for consumers. And it's not always about inventing something new. It's about providing, it's about making sure that consumers know where to go to, whether it be going to the Ombudsman Service for redress, going to training standards as well, or going to Advice Direct Scotland if what they simply need is some, what are your flight rights after the last 2 weeks' dreadful news on Thomas Cook.
So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thomas, you were talking about, you gave some examples earlier about some of the issues that have come up, like availability of cash and disparity in digital connectivity and issues like that. Has it been the case that they've never really had a home to go to for people to raise complaints or issues about these? And is that what Consumer Scotland might kind of begin to hoover up? Some of the issues that didn't have an obvious home to get to? Is that what the bill and the body will provide?
I think, Mr Coffey, that's an excellent question. I think there are two parts. The first, that's also part of it itself, is that there has not been a body that has had responsibility for looking at those issues, to understand what causes them, understand what the redress might be, and then advocate. But also, of course, some of these are, I mean, not so much ScotRail, but some of those other things like digital connectivity, these are emerging. I mean, we're all of a certain ages that certainly, the idea of sitting with your phone, there's an expectation now that broadband is now the fourth utility. People expect not just the 10 megabits a second USO minimum. They expect all the time to use the phone. In the last 30 years, we've gone from 24,000 branches across the UK in banks down to about 7,500. We have seen a reduction in ATMs as well. Those are more emerging issues, and that's something that, again, it's working with others. It's working with Ombudsman Service. It's working with Which. It's working with cabs to try and identify where these emerging threats are, and coming up with an action plan every year. And I would be so bold as to say I would be amazed if this committee didn't have suggestions for what it might choose to focus on in its first couple of years, because it can't do all of those issues in the first year. It could probably do 2. If, as it grows, it might do a third one a year.
Just one example that constituents bring to me and to ask you if this body might be able to do anything about it. And it's about buying tickets for concerts, theatres and so on, and the ridiculous plethora of fees that are attached to this. Multiple booking fees, for example. If you buy 4 tickets, you pay 4 booking. These kinds of issues have been a problem for a long number of years. How, and could we expect that issue to be dealt with by the body, and how would they manage to deal with that and make any recommendations to, I think it's the UK government in this case?
So I think as part of the UEFA Nations League next summer, the Scottish Government is bringing forward a bill around the secondary ticketing. I think that's correct, Convener. That's exactly the kind of, not in terms of next year, but the type of example where you could look and say, within Scotland we have a problem, We see that at big festival events. We see that at big sporting events. That consumers are being ripped off, and these are proposals. So it isn't just about going to the UK government all the time. It's the Scottish government, or it could be regulators, and saying we've identified this is the pattern of bad behaviour, and these are the measures that could be taken to address that.
We will look at that. And has anyone previous to this body's existence looked at that and had any success?
So we did some work on secondary ticketing at a UK level to highlight some of the practices. The CMA, to their credit, has done some work cracking down on some of those people like Viagogo. But there isn't enough work done on, for example, how big a problem is it in Scotland, and what are the powers that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government could take to address it.
Okay. Some potential there for us, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Dean Lockhart.
Convener, as currently drafted, the bill only protects individual consumers and doesn't extend to small businesses or sole traders. Do you think the bill has got the balance right in that regard?
I come back to my earlier statement. I don't believe it's needed. But if it were to go ahead, then no. I think we need to be more cognizant of all consumers. Small traders are consumers.
Thank you.
We are running an event today at the Tory Party conference on exactly that issue, the detriment experienced by small businesses. As we see it, a lot of micro businesses have exactly the same issues as consumers in terms of knowledge of the market, bargaining power, ability to enforce their rights when things go wrong. We see the Financial Ombudsman has just expanded their remit to now cover businesses of up to 50 employees. We are limited to 10 employees at the moment, so we are arguing that actually the protection of ADR should be extended, and we certainly agree that that micro businesses in Scotland should be entitled to the same protections.
I just guess the final question, what would be the cut-off point? Would it be the 10 employees based on what other legislation has done? What's the best practice?
I think it's fair to say that's the current figure that is used, less than 10 employees for a micro business.
Yeah. In the world of ADR, we're looking at, we are used to working at 10 employees or less, definition of a micro business. As I said, our argument now is to say, do the businesses that are slightly larger than that need protection? And we think they do.
Just one very brief final question, perhaps for myself. What are your views on the consumer duty aspect of the bill and what's proposed? Do you have a view on that?
We worked very hard to persuade the Scottish Government, not just ourselves, other organisations as well, that was a welcome step forward. Rail is a very good example. At the moment, there is not a duty on the rail body to consider consumers when running the railway. Anyone who lives in Fife, or indeed in Dumbarton, has probably suffered at the hands of ScotFail in the last couple of years. So I think that's exactly the kind of thing that will benefit. I mean, I think, to be fair, actually, we do agree with Citizens Advice Scotland that the exact wording needs to be looked at around this due regard. But fundamentally, it is a pioneering step. It's the first part of the United Kingdom that will have a consumer duty, and it's one of the things that the other administrations are looking at. So if we get Consumer Scotland right and we get the consumer duty right, I think Scotland will, as so often, be at the front end of improving the environment for consumers.
I see others nodding their heads. I don't know if Norman Kerr agrees.
Yep, no, I agree with that.
All right. Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. And oh, sorry, I beg Jackie Bailey's forgiveness. She, I think, wanted to ask one last very brief question.
Absolutely. Thomas Doherty mentioned Dumbarton. Would you not appreciate that actually MSPs in this building have consistently raised the issues of concern to government? We're going to have a debate this week. What is a government agency going to do that's going to be harder and different to what MSPs currently do?
So, I mean, the key thing to remember is Consumer Scotland is not going to be a government agency any more than Citizens Advice Scotland is not a government agency. It's going to be a consumer agency, It's going to be accountable to the Parliament, not to the government. And I am always in bewildered awe at Jackie Bailey's tenacity on behalf of the people of Dumbarton. And I would never, convener, be so brave or foolish to say that anybody could work as hard as Jackie Bailey.
There you go. Very good. I think we'll stop there, convener.
I think we will stop there. Thank you very much to all three for coming in. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session.